ASEAN is a fast-growing bloc with diverse cultures and emerging opportunities. With its thriving digital economy, rising wealth and trade growth, it is moving ahead rapidly. HSBC has been part of ASEAN's growth story for over 130 years. Our on-the-ground experts and global network offer you a single point of access to open opportunities across ASEAN.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Haslinda Amin, Bloomberg TV anchor and chief international correspondent for Southeast Asia. Welcome to our annual Bloomberg Asean Business Summit. And what a time to be hosting it. Not only is the world grappling with the pandemic 2 years on, we also have a war, surging inflation. Markets have been wild, huge gyrations. Now, over the course of the next 3 hours, we'll bring together policymakers, CEOs, industry leaders who will provide insights and share innovative ideas in such a critical time for the global economy. We'll hear from the South Bank Governor of the Philippines as well as Malaysia in just a moment. But before we get started, I want to acknowledge the support of our presenting sponsor, HSBC. Now, also a few housekeeping announcements. Tech issues. If you experience any issues with audio or video quality, do refresh your browser or use the chat box in the bottom right corner of your screen for support. Do engage with us on social media. Use the hashtag Bloomberg Asean. Engage with other attendees in the event chat in the bottom right corner of your screen. Easy enough, right? Now, let's kick it off with a few words from our sponsor, HSBC.
Good afternoon. My name is Amanda Murphy, and I'm the head of commercial banking for South and Southeast Asia at HSBC. And I'm delighted to have an opportunity to speak with you today at the Bloomberg Asean Business Summit. When we look out on the horizon, we can see that the world's uncertainties seem overwhelming. And we know that changes are needed. But it's in these changes that we can find tremendous opportunities. And I believe that this is a great time to invest in the future, a great opportunity to use this break in our business as usual to recalibrate our thinking and to recalibrate our business strategies, and to look towards a greener, more connected, and more prosperous future. The best businesses are already doing this. But we need to do more. Let me start with climate change. In economic terms, the Asian Development Bank estimates that if left unchecked, climate change can shave almost 11% of Southeast Asia's GDP by the end of the century. The human cost will also be devastating. Of the 300 million people at risk, 300 million people at risk from rising sea levels by the middle of this century, over 3/4 of them are here in Asia. And we know that Southeast Asia has already been exposed to extreme weather events. It's been exposed to floods, to droughts, as well as biodiversity and habitat losses. So the imperative to change is clear. Our business models need to evolve. Old technology needs to be replaced. Old thinking needs to be updated. And HSBC is supporting those businesses that are taking an active role in energy transition, because this is where we can have the greatest impact in making net zero a reality. We're establishing partnerships that aim to catalyze capital flows to the sustainable infrastructure space. And at the same time, though, we recognize the realities on the ground and the need to balance the competing interests of development and decarbonization. And that is why we are partnering with and we are engaging with our clients across the region as they build their transition to net zero. Because collaboration really does matter. It matters in the fight against climate change. No one company, no one sector And indeed, no one government can do it alone. Now, as a banker, the first question I often get asked is, sure, but how are we going to pay for this? And indeed, if we look at the numbers taken out of context, they can be quite frightening. For example, the ADP says that Asia needs to invest $1.7 trillion in infrastructure alone every year until 2030. But don't be alarmed. The money is there. The four big central banks expanded their balance sheets by over $12 trillion in the past 2 years alone. And the FT estimates last year that half of global assets under management, that's about $43 trillion, have been earmarked for green projects. So we have the means to do this. And it's our job as the financial intermediary to connect the money held by investors around the world with the green opportunities that are here in Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the region. And while we are getting our climate response right, we need to keep moving forward on other fronts to make sure that we continue to grow and continue to prosper. So what can governments do? What can ASEAN do to make that easier? And I think there are two words here: greater coordination. Now, ASEAN has made huge strides in reducing tariffs, but there is still significant work to be done to eliminate non-tariff barriers, particularly in the service sectors. According to the EU ASEAN Business Council, non-tariff barriers within Southeast Asia have increased by almost 60% since 2015. And this has undone much of the good work on tariff reduction. Everyone here in Southeast Asia knows that we sit at the heart of two of the biggest free trade agreements. Agreements like the RCEP and the CPTPP are great moves in the right direction, while sub-regional agreements at ASEAN level would really help us, help bolster and go a long way to realizing Southeast Asia's potential as an economic powerhouse. At the top of the agenda, we need to place data and digital services regulation. The current patchwork of different and sometimes conflicting national level regulations, they act as a brake on realizing technology's full potential to attract investment here and to power the next wave of growth. And this is particularly true when it comes to cross-border payments. Mobile technology has given every company, especially SMEs, an unprecedented global reach. Despite supply chain disruptions, transport costs are still at really low historic terms. So the only piece missing in our jigsaw is a way to facilitate cheap, reliable, and easy payment systems. Now, we're making progress from a financial services end, but we need more coherent, joined up trans-regional coordination, and that will accelerate our progress. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you will all agree that we have so much going for us in Southeast Asia, and the opportunities are so clear. The demographics, a growing population, a growing educated workforce, and a growing consumer class. Digitization, with a region to a fast-growing population of digital natives. And dynamism. The enterprise nature of Southeast Asia has produced such a vibrant startup scene that rivals anywhere else in the world. So through collaboration between countries and regions, between public and private sector, between financial institutions and corporations, Southeast Asia can certainly realize its potential as an economic dynamo that is way more than the sum of its parts. Before I go, may I quote a famous blessing from where I'm from, an Irish blessing. May the road rise to meet each of you. May the wind always be at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face and the rain fall softly in your fields. I'm so excited about the opportunities we have here. And I look forward to the sun continuing to shine. All of us have a key role to play in that. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I hope, and I know you will find the conference, the Bloomberg Asean Business Summit, to be really beneficial and insightful for you and for your future. Bye-bye for now.
Welcome back. It is all about inflation. Oil touched $139 a barrel, nickel topping $100,000 on the LME. Everything from energy to metals to agricultural products have been surging, begging the question, how will global policymakers respond? Will they prioritize economic growth amid elevated uncertainty, or will they choose to tighten even faster to contain inflation? Well, Nur Shamsia Muhammad Yunus is the governor of Bank Negara Malaysia. Benjamin Jokno is governor of the Philippine Central Bank. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Haslinda, and greetings from Kuala Lumpur. Well, the conflict in Ukraine is a real tragedy. So it does add a new source of uncertainty to the global economy. So thus far, the conflict, as what you have said, has led to a surge in commodity prices. And this could weigh on global economic recovery amid the backdrop of rising global inflation. So events continue to unfold. So at this juncture, it is still early to definitely size up the total impact of the conflict to our economy. What we know is that there are multiple channels at play, including trade, prices, and financial markets. So the extent of the impact of the conflict on the global economy and financial markets, and thus on Malaysia, would depend on, firstly, I would say, the length, breadth, and depth of the conflict. Secondly, the extent of financial and the extent of what I call economic and financial countermeasures. And thirdly, the policy reactions by relevant authorities. Malaysia, we are a net commodity exporter. So while we would be affected by lower global demand through lower exports, we do stand to benefit from the surge in commodity prices. But at the same time, further increases in commodity prices over a prolonged period would pose an upside risk to inflation. But policies in place by the government to contain excessive price pressure would somehow cushion the spillovers from these cost push factors in the short term. But over the medium term, we could see international trade and global manufacturing also being redirected to the region. And in terms of financial markets, adjustments following tightening financial conditions have been orderly so far. The removal of Russia from emerging market indices such as FTSE, MSCI may lead to rebalancing of global portfolios into the region. So any spillovers going forward, including adjustment in our domestic equities market, while we have this synchronized global risk aversion, would be mitigated by the resilience of the economy, the financial system, and the ample liquidity that we have in our financial market. So we do expect Malaysian economy to remain on its recovery path for inflation. Like what you have said, Haslinda, we remain vigilant of second round effects. Although we have not seen any broad-based above average price increases, we are also not seeing wage pressures that are excessive. So longer-term inflation expectations currently remain anchored. So we will continue to closely monitor the situation to assess the implication on the overall outlook for domestic inflation and growth.
Governor Jokno, we know that a lot of factors are in play. If you take commodities alone, oil, I mean, we have JP Morgan saying that oil will get to $185 a barrel by the end of the year. Is the oil shock of 2022 likely to be deflationary in the longer term? Is there a real risk of a global recession?
Before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we were doing very well on the inflation front. Our inflation performance in January and February is 3%. That's within our 2 to 4% target range. Now, because of what happened, I think, and precisely because of the oil, because the Philippines is an oil importing country, we totally depend on imported oil. So things have changed. But as Shamsha or said, this is early. There's highly uncertain times. So what we can only do at this time is do some price simulation. And based on our oil price simulation, inflation could still settle above the target range of 2 to 4%, only if crude prices average higher than $95 per barrel. Okay, $95, that's the threshold. Below $95 per barrel, inflation would settle within the target range. The highest ever value of Dubai oil, which we use, was recorded in 15 July 2008 at $141.33 per barrel. Now, should the worst case scenario oil prices reaching 120 to 140 per barrel on a sustained basis, not just 1 day or 2 weeks, 120 to 140 pesos per barrel, dollars per barrel, inflation would be 0.7 to 1 percentage point above the baseline. In brief, inflation would average between 4.4 to 4.7% under the worst case scenario.
Governor Shamsia, earlier you talked about how Malaysia is an oil exporter, so it is benefiting from higher oil prices. But the thing is, when you take a look at businesses, they are rushing to pass on the cost to consumers. If a doll, which usually costs $10, now costs $25, what would it mean for consumer sentiment? What would it mean for growth? How are you looking at it?
Well, like I said, there are many channels at play. Yes, we do have the pluses and the minuses. The pluses would be, higher income that will accrue to the commodity exporters, and that will cushion. And the other channel that I had mentioned would be through higher input prices that may affect production and investment, and thus, lead to higher inflation. But we also have continued slack in the economy and the labor market, and that will partly mitigate the upward pressure on inflation. So this is a very fluid situation that warrants a lot of monitoring, engagement with the industry to make sure how this price dynamics would affect their pricing and how it will affect, whether it will affect demand, whether it will cause excessive demand in the short term that will require some response. So this is something that we will continue to monitor and be vigilant against.
Governor Jagno, earlier you talked about how you'll start worrying about inflation when oil exceeds $95 a barrel. I want to point you towards the bond market. If you take a look at the spread between treasuries 2s and 10s, it's collapsing, suggesting that we're looking at perhaps a slowdown, even a recession. Is the bond market wrong in predicting that?
Well, I think there is a tendency to overreact under these certain conditions. So I think it's better to be level-headed, be rational, and we don't know whether this will last a few weeks, a few months, or a year, or more than a year. So I think, as said before, we just have to monitor the developments. There are many things happening, of course, right now. In addition to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have the what is already accepted, the normalization that will take place in the US. The Fed will adjust the rates, so that also affects everything. So this is a combination of lots of factors, okay? And so plus the uncertainty, and so it's magnified by nervousness on the part of some players. But I think the right thing to do at this time is be cool and assess the situation.
As you remain cool, Governor Jugno, I'm just wondering whether you've reassessed the number of times the Fed is likely to raise rates this year. When I spoke to Governor Periwajio, he says he maintains it'll be 3 rate rises for 2022. What are your thoughts on that? Has Ukraine changed that? Has the fallout in the equity markets changed that?
I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the uncertainties that it has developed, is certainly going to change the mood among the Fed members. I think instead of maybe a 50 basis point adjustment, it could be just 25 basis points. Instead of 5 adjustments, it could be 3. So we don't know. So we are waiting for their action. And that's why I think it's necessary to be patient. And on our part, we will be patient. And that I noticed that among Asian countries, we're not like the Latin American countries and some European countries. They already adjusted upwards the rates, except for South Korea and New Zealand. I think most Asian countries have not yet adjusted the rates.
Governor Shamsia, what assumptions are you making about Fed moves in 2022?
The prolonged conflict in Ukraine does pose considerable uncertainty to the global outlook and the commodity prices. And as I see it, this will add a layer of complexity to the decisions of the central banks. So, but nevertheless, when we look at the spillovers to Malaysia's domestic bond market and FX markets, the adjustments that we have seen so far, and more importantly, the impact of these adjustments on financial intermediation and the Malaysian economy, we do expect it to remain manageable for a variety of reasons. We have worked very hard since the Asian financial crisis, in fact, to have a deep and liquid local bond market. So the diverse investor base will continue to support orderly conditions and, more importantly, to facilitate price adjustments in the market. So with the economy on an improvement track, so any temporary adjustments to the bond yield should provide a good buying opportunity for investors. We also have a financial system where banks are the main where banks rely on deposits instead of the bond market to fund their financing activities, and they play a dominant role in financing economic activity in Malaysia. About 75% of financing in the economy are granted by the banks. So although we have a situation where the borrowing yields may be going up, but it will not translate into higher cost of funds for the banks. So these are some of the factors, Haslinda, that we think that volatility is going to be a given. But I think the efforts that we have put all these years to deepen the onshore market, the bond market, the FX market, and the range of hedging instruments that we have been working very hard with the investors to provide onshore so that they are able to manage the FX position, that will provide some what we call factors that will mitigate some of the spillover impacts and ensure orderly market conditions.
Bank Negara reviewed its policy recently, and it said that the war in Ukraine has emerged as a key risk to global growth as well as trade. What does it essentially mean in terms of monetary policy for you? Will you be holding rates longer? Will you, as Governor Jugno said earlier, remain patient?
Right. Well, the MPC conducts its monetary policy premised on achieving price stability and sustainable growth in Malaysia. So all these global developments are assessed through the lens of whether they affect the balance of risk to inflation and our growth outlook. And this is something that the MPC will continue to be data dependent and be vigilant on the recent developments and how it affects the balance of risk.
You stood pat for a long time now, in fact, since July 2020. And Alice, we spoke to say that they're expecting normalization to start in the second half of the year. Is that a fair assumption, you think?
Well, this is something that we'll continually assess. I mean, I can't preempt the MPC, but this is something that we'll assess. The economy is on a firmer growth path, and we will continue to assess, what would be the appropriate degree of monetary policy accommodation to make sure that this economic recovery is much more durable moving forward, while ensuring that inflationary expectations remain anchored.
Governor Jokno, might you raise your key rate Elliott plan? Because we know that you've said before that you'd like to see perhaps 4 to 6 quarters of steady growth, 5% unemployment. What might prompt you to change your mind?
Well, as you know, the economy grew at 5.6%. That's more than the expectation last year. And assuming that we meet our target this year of 7 to 9%, then I think we're still on track. We plan to adjust in the second half of the year. But as I said, we have already started the process of reducing our accommodative policy and winding our policies. For example, previously we lent to the national government something like 540 billion pesos. That's equivalent to 10.5 billion US dollars. That's interest free during the height of the COVID. Now recently it has been reduced to 300 billion US dollars, or rather pesos. That's 5.8 billion US dollars. And we expect that to be down to zero by the third quarter of this year. Now, on the government, on BSP's purchases of government securities in the secondary market, that has also gone down. During the first year of the crisis, 2020, we bought something like 19.4% of the total GS portfolio. It's down to 4.8% in the second year, 2021, and now it's down to 0.7%. So we have started the unwinding, but on the policy adjustment, we plan still to do that on the second half of the year.
So no risk of being behind the curve, yeah, Governor Jokno?
No, I don't think so, because I think the Philippine macroeconomic fundamentals are really sound. And so, for example, if the Fed normalizes, we are supported by a strong external buffers. Our gross international reserves is equivalent to about 10.2 months of imports. And the received doctrine is 3 months worth of imports is sufficient, okay? Plus, we have a steady inflow of foreign exchange from our overseas Filipino workers, from the business process outsourcing, and our FDIs was fairly robust last year. The foreign direct investment grew by 52.5% last year, just from January to November, and that's more than what we got before the crisis. And so we expect FDIs to continue, especially we have passed the recent legislation that will open up the economy. So I keep saying this, that despite the pandemic, we continue to focus on the structural reforms that are needed to make the Philippine economy more competitive.
We can't talk about the global economy without touching on China. Governor Shamsia, China has said it wants to grow at 5.5% in 2022. Is that enough to offset any drag from the war in Ukraine? Because JP Morgan has come up to say that, you know what, Russia's invasion of Ukraine will shave off around a percentage point from global growth this year. Is China enough to offset any drag there may be?
One thing good about Malaysia is, the diversification of our export markets and export products. So while, one country may suffer, disproportionately from the high oil prices and growth, there will be other countries that will benefit from that. So in terms of the growth, the weighted trade growth of our major trading partners, because of the diversification, the impact to Malaysia would be somewhat mitigated. So, and like I said, that so we are not just diversified in terms of the countries that we export to, even in the products. So there are certain products will benefit from the current unfortunate events that will, drive more demand, for example, and there will be other products that, they would suffer disproportionately from the supply chain disruption. So net, again, the situation is still fluid. So we need to, assess all these events and how it will affect the Malaysian economy and the financial markets.
Your thoughts, Governor Jukno? Do you think China can perhaps offset?
You mentioned China because while the entire a great majority of countries have already adjusted to maybe is in the process of raising or tightening. China, on the other hand, is the outlier. I think they even cut their policy rates and their reserve requirement. It is as if they cannot afford to have a single-digit growth. They're still growing, but it's much slower than they're used to double-digit growth, and they're not happy with a single-digit growth. I don't know whether they will succeed given the new environment, but as noticeably, it is the outlier.
Could China be a bigger risk than Russia's attack on Ukraine, you think, Governor Jukno? Could China be the risk?
I think so, because it's more connected with the entire world rather than Russia. I think the contribution of Russia to the global economy is much less compared to China, and so a falling China, rather a slowing China, could have a bigger risk than the current war right now in between Russia and Ukraine.
For Asian economies, for Southeast Asian economies, the currency stability is very important. The peso, Governor, recently broke a threshold of 51.50 to the dollar. How is peso weakness factoring into your policy outlook?
We continue to pursue a market-determined exchange rate. Our macroeconomic assumption, we're not targeting, but our macroeconomic assumption is that the peso will be between 48 to 53 per US dollar. Okay, now it's moving, but I would attribute that to the global uncertainty. We are confident with the current level of we're confident that we can address the volatility because, number one, as I said, we have a flexible exchange rate system. So we allow the peso to seek its own level. We only participate if there are huge fluctuations, because that could be a threat to our inflation targeting objective. We have existing liquidity enhancing and management tools, such as the US dollar repo facility, exporters dollar and yen rediscount facility, and the enhanced currency rate risk protection program. We have not used this for the longest time, but I hope we won't use them also. But as I said, in addition to the huge or to the hefty gross international reserves, we have a constant inflow of foreign exchange from our overseas Filipino workers. It grew by 5% last year, despite the pandemic. The overseas, rather the receipts from BPOs and also from our exports. Exports was also robust.
Intervention is still an option, Governor, because you've said before, you told us, in fact, in January, that the bank would look to intervene near 51.50. So intervention is an option for you.
We participate if there is a huge fluctuations. I must admit, when it was moving towards 48, we have to intervene. We don't want the peso to be so strong, because that will not be good for our overseas Filipino workers and our exporters, all right? So we just intervene if there is a need for it. But by and large, we allow it to seek its own level.
Governor Shamsia, we heard from Khazanah saying that Russia's stock outflow will probably land in markets like Malaysia, like Indonesia. How do you think that might play out in the Malaysian ringgit, in the Malaysian economy?
There will be rebalancing of portfolio because of the removal of Asia. So for index trackers, for example, they may rebalance their portfolio to mirror the weightages in the indices. So I think the region as a whole would benefit. In terms of what we have seen so far is still continued inflow. Last year, for example, we had an inflow of about $8 billion US, and year to date, we have been receiving inflows of about $2.3 billion US. And the volatility in our ringgit has been, much lower than what it was in the past. And for example, I have the numbers here where the 1 month implied volatility of the US dollar against the ringgit is around 4.2 versus the 5-year average of 4.6. So the market has been quite orderly. And the other thing that is benefiting Malaysia is we do have a pool of strong domestic institutional investors that can act as a shock absorber also if there are outflows in the country. And these domestic institutional investors do have the capacity to absorb the market. And more importantly, just like what Benjamin had said, for Malaysia, the exchange rate has been acting as a shock absorber. And that will insulate the impact of any volatility on the domestic economy.
Just one final question before I let both of you go. Perhaps you can start off, Governor Jokno. What do you deem as the biggest risk for 2022? What keeps you up at night?
Wow. I think still cybersecurity rather than anything, because we have embarked on a digitalization journey. And so, and it has succeeded, but it of course carries with it that risk. Okay? So that keeps me awake at night.
Governor Shamsia?
We are on a similar mind, Benjamin, that you're talking about the tail operational risk that any models will not be able to predict, and having that kind of disruptions to the financial system and the economy. So cyber risk would be one of the things at the top of my mind.
Governor Noor Shamsia and Governor Jokno, I thank you so much for your insights today. It's been a pleasure. It is a challenging time for all central bankers right now. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Haslinda.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And earlier, I spoke with Singapore's Foreign Minister, Vivian Balakrishnan. I started by asking him for the reasons behind Singapore's sanctions on Russia. Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Ukraine has been making headlines just about every day, and Singapore made headlines when it decided to impose sanctions on Russia. Quite a rare decision on the part of a small nation like Singapore. What was the key reason behind the decision?
The egregiousness of it all. The fact that it's such a dangerous precedent. The fact that it abrogates the norms of international law, the Charter of the United Nations, the fact that it's a big neighbor invading a smaller neighbor, the fact that it tramples over the concept of territorial integrity, of sovereignty, of independence. Even the allusion to historical mistakes and crazy decisions also rang alarm bells for us. If you look at what happened at the Security Council, except for the fact that Russia vetoed it clearly in its own self-interest, otherwise that resolution would have passed with sanctions to follow. So when we looked at the situation, added it all up, we thought this is a time that we have to take a stand, not because we're taking sides, but because these principles are existential for a tiny city-state.
What's different this time around, though? There have been wars before. This is the first time in about 40 years that Singapore decided to impose those sanctions.
Yes.
What's different? Why was it so important for Singapore to make a stand now?
Well, as I said just now, it's because it was so egregious. And it involved a permanent member of the Security Council. I'll give you an example. If you go back to 1978, the invasion of Cambodia, we took a stand, and in fact, we had to take a consistent, recurrent annual set of resolutions in the United Nations all the way from 79 to 1989, more than a decade. I'll give you another example. 1983, the United States invasion of Grenada. We voted against the United States, and I would quote Professor Tommy Koh, who was our permanent representative to the UN then, and he said there are times when our adherence to principles is more important than friendship. This is certainly one of those times. I think if you zoom the lens out, what we are witnessing now is the end of an era. Post-Second World War, the concept of sovereign equality, the United Nations, trying to resolve disagreements peacefully, having the Security Council, economic integration, respect for boundaries, was a formula for peace and prosperity for almost 8 decades. Right? This is perhaps even a bigger moment than the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, because it puts a screeching full stop to that age. And now we are facing an uncertain bifurcation. This can escalate horribly. We are all looking at the abyss of stagflation. The big if now is what decisions and actions China takes. If you get a deepening of the bifurcation of the global economy, of supply chains, of technology, this will be a very, very different world. And if you just look at it from an economic perspective, what a global bifurcation means, 3 things. Number 1, progress will be slowed down. For the last 8 decades, let's take the science as an example. We were able to build on each other's advances, research and development, software, build a common stack. And that has seen rapid advances in technology. A bifurcated stack will not advance at the same pace. The second economic example is that if we all look for autarky, either in-source or friend source, you will have inflation because it will cost more, because it will be less efficient. The third economic impact of a real hard bifurcation is reduced interdependence, and therefore a greater propensity to allow quarrels to get out of hand. So sanctions are double-edged swords. This is not something you engage in trivially, and that's another reason why we have been so careful never to do that unless in most egregious circumstances.
I'll pick up on bifurcation slightly later. People usually say your economic policy dictates your foreign policy. Would you have thought twice about imposing sanctions if that nation happens to be China, for instance? I mean, if you take a look at Russia, trade accounts for only 1% with Singapore. But if it's a country like China, trade accounts for 13%. So there is a lot more at stake. Would you think twice before making such a decision?
Well, I would say foreign policy actually begins at home. So first, what are your circumstances? What are your country's principles? Are your people united? And do you have the means, the capability, and the resolve to advance your interests? So it begins at home. The economy is certainly very important. And as I said, sanctions are a double-edged sword. And it leads to greater separation and ultimately to bifurcation if the two halves are far enough apart and viable separately. I don't want to get into hypothetical situations on China. To put things in perspective, the GDP of Russia is 1/10 that of China. And in terms of its trading relationship, certainly with respect to Southeast Asia, it's a tiny fraction of China. So I don't want to get into that kind of hypothetical question or situation. But I would also add, from my experience interacting with China, China is also very aware of all this. And I think that's why if you look at, or you listen to what China has said, they have doubled down on the importance of territorial integrity and sovereignty. So no question about their position on that. I can't help detecting some discomfort, some awkwardness on their part with respect to this egregiousness of the invasion of Russia into Ukraine.
Having said that, how do you expect China to respond? There have been reports suggesting that perhaps Russia is looking to China for assistance, perhaps even for weapons.
I have no information on that, so I'm really not in a position to comment. But I am making the point that China does have important principles at stake to affirm and to live up to. I'm making the point that China has far more than even Russia in terms of its economic stake in an integrated, multilateral, rules-based world. And, but China will make its own decisions. And we will have to watch. I think the decisions over the next few days, next couple of weeks, are going to be absolutely crucial to this new world that is emerging ahead of us. And some people have said the most dangerous phase is when a new era is being born. The norms, the rules, the expectations are still inchoate, and that's when the risk of misunderstandings, miscalculations are enormous.
You talk about bifurcation, you talk about a new era. Are there echoes of a new Cold War? I mean, the last thing the region needs right now, Asia, Southeast Asia, the last thing the region needs right now are two blocs, one led by the US, the other by Russia and China. Is there a sense there are echoes of a new Cold War?
If you put yourself in Europe, it's clear that Cold War has already started. In fact, you have a shooting war in part of Europe already. If your question is what is it that Asia is looking for, and particularly Southeast Asia and Singapore, that's not our interest at all. What we are looking forward to is that, look, Singapore and Southeast Asia have been key beneficiaries of this system for the last 8 decades. Economic integration, free trade, flow of capital, investments, connectivity, mutual interdependence, and open and inclusive political and economic architecture. So if you ask any of my neighbors, what are you looking for? That's what we're interested in. We're interested in trade, we're interested in investments, we are interested in keeping our region open to all the superpowers. We're not looking for one or the other or to play games. And the worst possible outcome is to be an arena for proxy wars and superpower contestations. We have no intention of taking sides and being a cat's paw or being a vassal state for one or the other. So we're watching. There are obviously what happens in Europe will have impact on Asia, but I'm signaling what Asia's preoccupations are.
Given your concerns, the U.S. has come out to say, or rather there's some suggestions perhaps that the U.S. is trying to build an Indo-Pacific NATO. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see the U.S. trying to?
I would dismiss that out of hand.
Why?
Look at it from a Southeast Asian or an ASEAN perspective. ASEAN is not a military alliance. That's the first point. The second point is that we're not looking for one or the other superpower to be a godfather to Southeast Asia. Not at all. So the arrangements, the reference to NATO, the reference to Europe, the reference to the post-Second World War aftermath, that's all irrelevant to us as far as what we are keen on. ASEAN is meant to be an open, inclusive association focused on trade, economic integration, inclusive and expanding our bridges to all our partners, including the superpowers. And we're not interested in military alliances and godfathers. So no, I would dismiss that out of hand.
There's been no consensus within ASEAN. In fact, you said in Parliament that ASEAN leaders stayed up till the wee hours of the morning coming up with a statement which did not even refer to Russia, neither did it refer to its stance. Why was it so difficult for ASEAN to come to consensus?
Well, I would look first at what we did agree on. We all agreed on the importance of territorial integrity. We all agreed on sovereignty. And we all agreed that the situation in Ukraine was one of grave concern. In our second statement, we also asked for an immediate ceasefire. For the 10 of us with such diverse perspectives, to be able to agree on these key bull points, I think was significant. I think we can quibble about whether Russia was named explicitly or not. But as far as I was concerned, the bottom line was territorial integrity, sovereignty, and getting. So
you're
all
quite
of us,
satisfied with the statement that was given by ASEAN?
I mean, frankly, I was pleasantly surprised we could even get that far. And I say this in all seriousness because, again, you have to understand the diversity in ASEAN. Similarly, the fact that only 2 ASEAN members abstained at the General Assembly. Frankly, even that exceeded my expectations. Again, this is not a criticism of ASEAN. This is my realistic assessment of the diversity within ASEAN. So the fact that we've gotten so far, to me, is very encouraging. It shows that we have consensus on what's really important, and we are able to express ourselves and take a stand.
For the outside world, there was no consensus when it comes to ASEAN on its perception to do with Russia's attack on Ukraine. There's been a lack of progress in terms of the situation in Myanmar. Does it pose a challenge to ASEAN's centrality? Will it erode ASEAN's relevance going forward, especially when it comes to geopolitical challenges?
My frank assessment is that we've actually done better than expected. And there are a couple of dimensions to your question. Let's deal with Myanmar. I think if we come back to first principles, if we agree on political independence, on territorial integrity and sovereignty, you will understand why we are so, in a sense, reserved or even constrained with respect to what's happening within Myanmar. Meaning, we have to adhere to the principle that the ultimate outcome of the situation in Myanmar has to depend on the people of Myanmar. And external interference will only make things worse. And therefore, ASEAN's approach to Myanmar has been to work on the 5-point consensus which our leaders agreed to. And we are very disappointed there has been no progress, but nevertheless we will keep pushing. And ultimately, the key elements of the 5-point consensus: stop the violence, especially against unarmed civilians. Number 2, there needs to be, honest to goodness, political dialogue between Daw Aung San Suu Kyi, the leader of the NLD, on one hand, with the military on the other hand. Everything else is secondary. But we can try our best to bring the 2 horses to the waters. Whether they drink from the same water and they actually communicate is a very different order. But we must be patient, and we must not try to take shortcuts, which will unwittingly make things worse.
There's rising geopolitical tensions everywhere in the world. Yes. Do you think at some point this will lead to an arms race? We're already seeing the likes of Europe beefing up its defense spending. We're seeing Australia doing the same. Singapore spends about 3% of its GDP on defense, and I think there's been an increase of about 6% since the year before. Could we see an arms race in the region? Or the world, for that matter?
I would take a step back and say that, what has been remarkable over the past few decades, I would say particularly over the last 4 decades, is what some commentators have called a peace dividend. Meaning, the prospects of a world war, the prospects of a major conflagration were actually so low. Many countries, and especially in Europe, could afford to spend less on defense. I think it was a mistake to assume that that is the norm. So what you're watching now, even if you watch the budget, say, of Germany, and I'm sure of the other European countries, is I think you're getting a reversion to the mean, which means that every country needs to make sure, as we do in Singapore, that we have invested enough to be able to defend our own interests. What Ukraine illustrates categorically, nobody is going to shed blood for you. You have to stand up and be prepared to fight and defend what is yours and your way of life, and whatever it takes. And therefore, if you accept that this is a reversion to the mean, I do see increased expenditures on defense across the board, across the world, because we are going into a more dangerous world. But the point is to understand that last 40 years have been a unique and, in fact, a wonderful period of peace and prosperity. And our concern is, please don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Yes, we do know this, our world needs reform. You have to deal with inequality domestically, you have to deal with polarization, you have to deal with the challenges of the digital revolution, we have to deal with pandemics, still ongoing, and we have to deal with climate change. What do all these problems of the global commons require? It requires good sense, it requires sufficient consensus, it requires a multilateral rules-based world, it requires access to peaceful resolution of disputes. So that's the position that Singapore takes, you see. So coming back to your first question, why did we make this such an important stand and even underline it with unilateral sanctions? It's because we believe we are at an inflection point. And for what is worth, little Singapore is standing up for principles and expressing a hope for the rules of the engagement for this new era.
Russia's attack on Ukraine prompted concerns that China could do the same to Taiwan. And China has come out to say that it is a completely different scenario. How are you assessing the risk of that?
I agree with China that it's a completely different set of circumstances. And I don't think we should get into that kind of speculation and trying to draw parallels from it. The more important point is this, right? That once you allow these principles to be abrogated, you make unilateral resort to violence more likely, and you create a more dangerous world. Coming back to sanctions again, I completely agree with the fact that sanctions are double-edged, and that's why it's not something we engage in lightly. But it's, for what it's worth, it's a symbol of how important this is, and you have to make, hopefully, others in future who are thinking of unilateral resort to violence think twice. But that's a global, like I said, the rules of engagement for a new era. Taiwan is a far more complicated question that, we'll need a far longer discussion on this.
I want to quickly touch on the Indo-Pacific economic framework, which some say, perhaps you included, say that it's been politicized, something that can be used against China.
Singapore is a tiny city-state. Our trade is more than 3 times our GDP. So when we say we believe in free trade, it's not a debating point, it's lifeblood. when we say we actually look forward ultimately to a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. It may sound grandiose, it may sound impossible, but we actually do believe in it. What have we done so far?
But is trade being politicized?
No, but let me come to that, because you have to start with the end in mind, you see. If you know that's what we're after, what have we done so far? ASEAN succeeded in getting the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. 10 of us plus 5, unfortunately, India opted out. And that, frankly, primarily because of their concern with China. The other building block is the CPTPP. And that, again, it is frankly a strategic error on the part of the United States to have walked out of a skyscraper that it was a major architect for. Frankly, every time I go to Washington, I continue to make this point that actually the best thing you could do would be to return to the TPP.
Minister Vivian Balakrishnan, we thank you so much for your time today. Great insights. Thank you, sir.
Take care.
Well, welcome back. Now, as we've been saying, markets have been obsessed with the Fed liftoff for the last 18 months, and it's finally here amid a change backdrop, a war that sent commodity prices even higher, also a sell-off in the markets. Now, let's get perspective from Indonesia's Finance Minister, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, and Philippine Finance Secretary, Carlos Dominguez. Thank you both for joining us. Minister Sri Mulyani, let's start with you. It is about inflation. It is about surging commodity prices. How do you see higher inflation pressure building in 2022 for Indonesia?
Well, first, for Indonesia, even last year, we have the inflation, which is relatively very mild, 1.6%. January and February, we have a little bit increase at slightly above 2%. If you compare with many other advanced country or even emerging country, this level of inflation is still relatively very low. But we are very mindful that the global commodity price and supply disruption, even before the Russian invasion to Ukraine, is already creating a pressure on the price. And that can be seen from many of the advanced country inflation rate and some emerging country, which is already increased quite significant. And that definitely will have to impact first, of course, the response on the monetary policy in many advanced countries in terms of tightening. And then the second one, of course, with increasing inflation, it will also affect the purchasing power. So it will affect the consumption-driven recovery. So these two effects need to be responded as well as anticipated. For Indonesia, some of this commodity price increase has not been transmitted into consumer price because administered price policy by the government. Some of it is also explained by our relatively stable food price like rice, which in the past 2 years has been very fortunate with continuous rain. And that's also creating a buffer for us. But we are also very vigilant with, for example, like other food price, including cooking oil and soybean, as well as now wheat because of this Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, that will have some significant impact for some commodity in Indonesia. We've already made calculation. There is certainly pressure on this price to the inflation in the next couple of months, and especially also for Indonesia, because we are anticipating to have a Ramadan and Eid, which is going to happen in the next 2 months. So seasonality, commodity price definitely will have a potential implication to the recovery process of the economy in Indonesia. But the government will use our tools, both fiscal, monetary, as well as even intervention on the market in order for us to be able to first making sure that the recovery process will continue. The second, try to mitigate the impact, the negative impact of this extreme increase commodity, including oil, fuel, as well as mineral, using our fiscal tools. And the third one is to make sure that the availability of this goods and services is going to be there when the demand is going to improve or increase with the recovery process after the pandemic. So we will use all the tools in order for us to navigate this very challenging situation from the both pandemic, which is not yet over, as well as now the new geopolitical risk.
Secretary Dominguez, how is the Philippines looking at inflation? Might your 7 to 9% growth target be at risk?
Well, basically, as I said, we came out of a very good last quarter of 2021. We grew at 7.7% year on year. And for the full year, we grew at 5.6%. We were basically taking off already since our infection rates from COVID are well within manageable levels. However, this conflict has hit us in basically 4 channels. The first is through the commodity markets, as Sri Mulyani has said earlier. Prices of commodities, oil, coal, wheat, corn have risen. We have seen also disruptions in the financial markets, with interest rates getting a big boost from the crisis. The interest rates were already rising. Third, we are looking at a possible slowdown in foreign investments. Last year, we had the highest foreign investments we've had ever, at over $10 billion US. And we think that, this crisis is going to make people, particularly in the West, who are planning to invest elsewhere, think 2 or 3 times. And of course, the fourth channel is the effect on our fiscal space. We are definitely looking at mitigating the effects of inflation. Our inflation rate for the first 2 months of this year was exactly in the middle of our target, which was 3% over year on year. And we think that this inflation rate will this crisis will push our inflation rates quite a bit higher. But we are ready to tackle this. We're going to mitigate the effects on the poorest members of our society by providing subsidies for the poorest 50% of our households, as well as subsidies for public transportation. So we are also looking at the different monetary tools to address this crisis. But again, it's very unfortunate that this crisis is coming right after we are just quite getting over the COVID pandemic. But fortunately, the Philippines has a lot of tools similar to what Her Excellency Sri Mulyani has mentioned, and we will use all of them to ease the effects on our population.
Secretary Dominguez, JP Morgan says that an escalation of the war in the Ukraine and that commodity shock may shave off about 0.4% off your GDP target. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, we are taking a look at it right now. It all basically depends on how long this crisis is going to last. The longer it takes, obviously, the worse it's going to be for everyone because of the uncertainties in the commodity markets and the financial markets. So we're taking a close look, and we are looking at the possibility that this crisis will end soon, although we realize that there's going to be a bit of a long tail in getting back to normal again.
Minister Sri Mulyani, talking about the impact of higher commodity prices on your budget for government subsidies, could this push the budget deficit higher than the expected 4% of GDP this year?
Well, last year, our fiscal consolidation is actually accelerated much faster than what we originally designed. 2021 budget year, we end up with a fiscal deficit which is 4.6%. This is almost 1 percentage point lower than what we initially planned for 2021. This year, of course, the revenue side, which increased 21% last year, on January, the growth of our revenue is even close to 55%. And spending side is relatively steady. Last year, our spending only increased by 7%, and that's why we have such a very good deficit outturn, which is much, much stronger than what we initially. This year, we are going to expect the same trend on the revenue side. As I said, by January, it's already increased by almost 55%. And that's contributed both by tax, non-tax, as well as the excise. And this is a good start for 2022. And until February, we still see the revenue growth is still above 20%. On the other hand, the spending side in the first 2 months of this year has been relatively very mild. The growth is almost even zero. So we are actually having a surplus on our deficit. We are very mindful that the rest of the year, that is the next 10 months, due to this geopolitical situation, that we are going to anticipate quite a lot of pressure, especially as I said earlier, as well as Minister Dominguez earlier mentioned about the commodity price. Some of them will be passed through to the consumer in reflecting by the price in the market. Some will be absorbed by the government, and that's in the form of subsidy. So there are two responses from the fiscal side. There is an increasing subsidy, especially on the fuel, electricity, but also to some extent, the food price, like the cooking oil, that we are using the revenue coming from the CPO increase. So we use this combination. But some commodity, the pressure on the price will be passed through to the consumer. And that's why we are expecting slightly above inflation. Now, in terms of the fiscal consolidation and the posture of our budget 2022, before the extreme increase of the commodity, we actually expect, because of very strong performance in 2021, we actually expect for this year, the deficit is even declined further to slightly below 4%. But of course, with this situation, we will see that the deficit may be a little bit widened, but you have to be very also remember that our budget this year, according to the law which is passed by the parliament, was designed with the deficit around 4.8%. We will expect that this the achievement of our deficit will be lower than this, maybe even not slightly, but significantly lower than that. But the composition is still subject to what response of policy, especially during this very uncertain and dynamic situation. The strength of the Indonesia economy and response in the past 2.5 years during this pandemic is because we continue maintain fiscal flexibility. We can refocus and reallocate the spending in a much quite fast and timely way because of the approval of the parliament. And that's been very effective in dealing with the uncertainty, whether that was due to the pandemic and now due to the geopolitical situation. So flexibility as well as the agility is also very, very important. On the other hand, the fiscal space is going to be continue maintained or strengthened. Right. We do understand that this is actually an exceptional time for all countries in the world, but Indonesia in a relatively good shape on the fiscal side.
Consumers on the receiving end, and we know that at some point, companies will have to pass on the cost to consumers. Is there a need, Secretary Dominguez, to perhaps suspend or adjust tariffs on certain types of food, commodity imports? Your thoughts on that? Of course, this is to contain inflation.
Well, basically, we had a long discussion. Excuse me.
Go ahead.
Basically, we had a long discussion on this matter, and we have decided that we will not suspend tariffs on fuel. However, to ease the potential inflation on food, we are going to drop tariffs on food items that we import. Basically, we entered into the pandemic as well as this crisis from a position of strength. Since 2016, we have been very active in reforming our tax system. We have actually broadened our tax base, increased our collections of taxes as a percentage of GDP, and we have spent quite a bit in our Build program. So we came into the pandemic in a strong position. And as the pandemic ended, we also began to, we actually passed 3 very important bills liberalizing our economy. And this will stand us in good stead as we move ahead through this crisis of due to the conflict in Ukraine. One of the biggest items that have supported us is our rice tariffification program, where we have basically taken out the price of rice from the inflation figures. Rice has been very steady, and even prices have even dropped. And it's no longer price of rice is no longer a driver of inflation. So we are looking at this again, as I said, from a position of strength. And although we are very concerned about how long this crisis will last, because as the time goes on, our strength will be eroded. Thank you.
Minister Mulyani, of course, we have to take a look at oil surging as much as $139 a barrel. Some say 185, 200 may be coming. If local fuel prices are not raised, Pertamina is expected to book losses of as much as $500 million. Do you think there's a need to raise prices? And if so, how big an increase are you looking at?
Well, first, we have to really look at not only one commodity. As I said earlier, within the context of navigating and managing this recovery process, we will use all tools as well as source of uncertainty that potentially threatening the recovery process. Fuel, electricity definitely will have the implication due to the oil, gas increase, even coal price, which is creating a cost pressure on the cost of the electricity as well as fuel in Indonesia. We have calculating, of course, with some scenario, if you are not going to be able to pass through all those pressure to the consumer, what does it mean in terms of the subsidy or compensation that we have to pay for the Pertamina as well as even PLN? And that's definitely will contribute to the increasing spending. But as I said, the third year of the pandemic, actually this year, we still have around 450 trillion of what we call it recovery fund. And we are going to use this recovery fund first, of course, to still continue supporting on the health spending, which is still very important. We want to achieve 70% of vaccination and even providing booster so that the pandemic or the COVID is not going to create uncertainty on this recovery process. Second one, we provide social protection, additional cushion because of the increasing price of commodity that will then affecting the purchasing power, especially for the vulnerable household, just like my colleague, Minister Dominguez mentioned. We are providing additional cushion on social spending. The third one is, of course, we are going to then decide what administered price that can be then adjusted with this kind of changing global environment. Will be very selective, will be very measured, will be also in this case looking at our own strength of the recovery, but also at the same time, we have to be committed to the consolidation of our fiscal. So the combination of the commitment to reduce the deficit below 3% next year, on the one hand, and on the other hand, we are going to make sure that the recovery will be actually built on a strong foundation and the ability to cushion the shock, which is mainly coming from the external. Right. These three combinations that we are now managing, and I think so far until this March, our ability to do those three triple objective is relatively on track. So we will have the ability in terms of managing our fiscal pressure, providing support in terms of both subsidy, direct or indirect through the commodity, and at the same time also making sure that the recovery is going to be in a firm ground.
We've been talking about Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia. What do you make of the consequences of US sanctions on Russia's central bank, which effectively cancels its reserves? Would that encourage you to diversify your own reserves, Secretary Dominguez?
Well, we're very concerned about sanctions, because they eventually will affect us. We are not directly affected, but, it's like a ricocheting bullet. Sometimes we get hit. On the sanctions on the central bank of Russia, we actually will have no effect on us since our trade relations with Russia are quite limited, and same with the Ukraine. But this will certainly affect world trade, continue the disruption that was started during the pandemic of logistics and the ease of doing business, particularly in Europe. We are concerned that there might be a effect on the vigorousness of the economies in Western Europe and the United States, who are our big trading partners. So, we are concerned. We are not directly affected by these sanctions, but we are quite concerned on the effects on the overall world economy.
Minister Shri Mulyani, might you do more business in other currencies, say the yuan? There's been greater demand for the Chinese currency.
Well, first, I think what is happening in Ukraine definitely creating a new sense for all policymakers in the world, whether we are going to face a totally new world order. Globalization has definitely become one of the most important victims of this conflict, because then people don't trust the global supply chains with some uncertainty coming, whether from the military operation or other sanction which can be imposed. And that is one of the most important setback for the global economy. As we are witnessing in the past 3 or even 4 decades, many countries, especially emerging and developing countries, they were able to reduce poverty, to increase prosperity, because they are linked to the global economy through trade, through investment. With this conflict, when then there is uncertainty regarding the security of this system, definitely will affect the change as well as the implication on the strategy for growth in each country. As of, I think, the ability to diversify of the currency in Indonesia since 97-98, after the financial crisis in Asia, including Indonesia, as well as the global financial crisis, we also, in this case, within ASEAN, we've already, Bank Indonesia and some central bank in ASEAN has already also initiated using the local currency for our trade relation. That's also including with the China. But if you look at the percentage, it's still relatively insignificant. So whether this global order will be changed radically and permanently, this is really something that need to be watched. And of course, within the context, for example, like G20 and economic cooperation, we do want the world to come back to the cooperation spirit, because only through this kind of cooperation that all countries will have the opportunity to improve and increase the prosperity of their people and also to achieve progress in their economy. So we do hope that this kind of situation can be restored.
I'd like to touch on your fundraising plans. Secretary Dominguez, any update on plans to sell at least $500 million of ESG bonds? Will you push through with it?
Well, we are evaluating the market at the moment. As you know, the market is very volatile, and we are taking a very, very close look at the issuance of our green bonds, which is in the pipeline. We have not yet made a final decision on that, but we are going to be ready as soon as the market conditions, improve or stabilize.
What other offshore bond markets will the government consider tapping in the first half, or at least before you step down as finance secretary?
I beg your pardon again?
What other offshore bond markets will you consider tapping before you step down as finance secretary?
Definitely we're looking at the samurai market. But basically, we rely on our domestic market to the extent of 70 or 72% of our bond financing. The foreign financing is just less than 30% of our total package. And in the meantime, we have been really developing our local capital markets together with the support of the monetary policies in reducing the reserve requirements of our banks here. So again, we look at both markets, but depend more on our domestic peso bond markets.
It is a risk-off sentiment. Minister Mulyani, are you concerned about the appetite for Indonesian bonds?
Well, so far, of course, Indonesia enjoyed, as I said, 2021 end of the fiscal year was actually in a very good result. And we have what you call it cash surplus to start our fiscal year 2022. Within the context of financing our deficit, I think the option domestic and foreign is still very open. As of now, we rely on a domestic market, as also Minister Dominguez mentioned, that the ability to actually issue domestic bonds, especially because the role of the foreign buyer has been declined sharply into only 19%. So we are deepening our bond market domestically, and that's also creating a much more stable. And combined with our external balance, which is strong, that's also creating a domestic local currency denomination bonds, which actually the spread to the US dollar bonds at 10 years is narrowing. It's actually not widening. So the increase of the yield since the crisis in Ukraine is actually quite limited if you compare with many other emerging countries. So we are actually still continue enjoying first, of course, the cash surplus that we are having. And second one, domestic market deepening on the bonds market, especially government bonds market. The third one, we also at the same time still have what we call it the arrangement with central bank. We have 3 years arrangement with central bank, Bank Indonesia, on first that they are playing as a standby buyer on the primary market, and at the same time, the direct primary placement, which is related to our spending on both health and social spending. This is providing us with a cushion around 244 trillion. So this combination is actually provide us with the ability to maneuver, especially when the market, global market, foreign market is still in a very unfavorable like today. On the same time, we also still can rely on other alternatives, like, for example, the samurai bond mentioned by Minister Dominguez, and also policy loans coming from multilateral development bank. So these are all providing us with choices, but we are very mindful that this kind of situation definitely need to be maintained and managed very carefully, because there is always a limit. But at the same time, today we are enjoying quite choices that is available for the government to choose in terms of financing of our deficit. Last note, of course, because our expected deficit is going to be declined quite significantly, that's also providing us with a much less pressure on the fund.
And just like that, our 25 minutes are up. And just like that, our 25 minutes are up. Philippine Finance Secretary Carlos Dominguez, I thank you so much for your insights today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Michelle Fay Cortez, Senior Medical Reporter and Healthcare Editor for Bloomberg News in Asia. Today we're having a very important conversation, especially considering that last week was the 2-year anniversary of the World Health Organization declaring coronavirus a pandemic. Today we're going to be talking about the great global healthcare divide, specifically the inequity in distribution of vaccines in order to prevent infections. I'm delighted to welcome Indonesia's Minister of Health, Minister Budi Gunadi Sadikin, and the World Health Organization's Regional Director for the Western Pacific, the World Health Organization's Regional Director for the Western Pacific, Dr. Takeshi Kasai. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being with us. So, normally when we talk about inequity when we're looking at healthcare, one of the things that we talk about is money. But one of the things that really struck me when we look at the early outbreak, the first year of the coronavirus, across Asia, we saw a phenomenal response, really low rates of infection before we had vaccines and treatments available. Now that tells me that there were some things happening on the ground that really did prepare Asia and Indonesia to handle this outbreak. Minister Budi, I'm wondering if you can tell us what was the situation in Indonesia? How prepared were you for something like this, once in a century type of a pandemic?
At the beginning, to be honest, we are not expecting a huge, big pandemic like this. So when it happens, what we did is very reactive. We just limiting our border for incoming passengers, and that helped delay a little bit the surge of the cases to the country. But then, as the virus, is going across the globe, we also got hit, and then it follows the several spike and peak like in other countries also. So again, if you ask me, we are actually caught off guard a little bit, but what we did at the beginning, and it's quite successful to delay the dramatic increase of the cases, is by closing our borders. But then again, the virus has keep coming, and then we have to face another surge like what happened in other countries. But that delay gives us some time to make preparations, learning from what other country has done. Back to you.
Yeah. Dr. Kasai, we were talking earlier about the response to SARS, of course, in 2003. So there was some awareness that there was danger to be had and preparation needed to be put in place. Can you walk us through what kind of progress has been made in terms of preparing for a pandemic across Asia?
Sure, Michelle. Our region is actually very diverse, and there are countries actually population density is very high or very limited healthcare capacity, or many vulnerable populations, such as people working in the factory, prone to infections. And our region is the one that hit hard by the SARS 2003, as you mentioned. And when we listed the lessons after the SARS, some of them we can fix it quickly, but the majority of them, we noted that it takes a very long time to fix it because we have to address the system. And therefore, we developed the regional action framework and then address those things step by step, tailored to the context, but most importantly, learn and then improve and not just the central level, but subnational level, and can do that because of their partnership. And this COVID-19, member state, the countries in the regions are fully utilizing those investments they have put in the past. Over to you.
It does seem like early in the outbreak, some parts of Asia, having had the experience with SARS, we saw a good uptake, for example, of things like wearing masks and social distancing, which seemed to control some of the outbreak. But of course, what everyone believes is going to end the pandemic is going to be the use of vaccinations. Now, it is remarkable the fact that we had, a handful of vaccines available within a year of this novel virus being detected. So that's astonishing. But in terms of actually distributing them, we saw widespread variation, right? More than 10 billion vaccines have been administered, 3 billion of them in China, 500 million in the United States. But it's even more sharp distinctions when you look at the per person number, right? In China, there's 220 shots for every 100 people. In the US, it's about 200 shots. In Europe, it's over 200. In Indonesia, we have about 130 shots for every 100 people in Indonesia. So my question, Minister Budi, maybe you can address this. To what extent was there a challenge in getting access to these vaccines? Was the problem actually being able to get them? Was it a cost in terms of paying for them? Or was it more of an issue of administering them once you did get them on the ground?
So the first problem with Indonesia, because we are not the vaccine producers, is getting the vaccine on time. So when we launched our vaccination program on January 13, 2021, which is maybe around a month after the major countries that produce vaccine launch their programs, we only have a limited amount of vaccines. So the problem is not about the capacity to do vaccination program, because Indonesia did a lot of several mandatory vaccination program. The problem is access to vaccine. But recently, after our business-to-business deal start coming in with the Chinese vaccine, then we start picking up the number of vaccination programs. And then close to the end of 2021, I believe on fourth quarter, then we start receiving large doses from Gavi, from WHO, and from CEPI. So those vaccines really help us to reach the numbers of vaccination, which is by this morning is 355 million doses that we have been able to do for 193 million people. And our vaccination rate at the peak last January is around 2 million doses per day, which is now is around 1 to 1.2 million doses per day that we deliver. And it is, again, after we have a lot of access, not only from bilateral that we can do deal business to business, but also from contribution from COVAX. And for your information, the COVAX doses recently increased quite a lot because they found Indonesia as a country that can vaccinate quickly. As you mentioned, it's not about only access in the last 3 to 6 months. When you have access, you have vaccine and distribute to a country, I heard this directly from Gavi, but the country cannot execute, then the vaccine become expired. So the reason why Indonesia suddenly received hundreds of millions of doses of free vaccine from COVAX, because we have that speed to do vaccinations. Sometimes it's more than 2 million doses per day. So COVAX, that they give vaccine to us, feel happy because the vaccine is not going to expire, but can be used and deliver the jabs to the people. But again, the first problem is access. But now the access is there. The issue with other countries is about whether you can do vaccination program fast enough to consume all the supply of vaccine that you have. Thank you.
Being nimble on the ground when it comes to distribution of vaccines and making sure they're getting to where they need to be is absolutely critical. Dr. Kasai, I'm wondering if you can speak to us about the situation with COVAX, how satisfied you are with how it's played out. Obviously, at the beginning, there were some challenges in terms of getting access to vaccines. You know, we all heard the criticisms of the US and Europe that were essentially keeping those shots, had locked up all of the initial doses that were manufactured. So how big of a hurdle was that in the beginning of the outbreak? And where do you think we are now in terms of making sure that we are getting the vaccines to the places where they are needed and will be used?
Thank you, Michelle. Ensuring the fair access of the vaccines to all countries in the pandemic is not a charity. It is a critical strategy to control the pandemic. So far, our member states, together with the support from the partners, we are now in the relatively good shape. But to reach this point, there have been so many challenges that they faced. For example, the global shortage of vaccines, as Honorable Minister mentioned, we encountered that challenge with so many barriers, including a limited production capacity or supplies of the raw materials, of trade barrier. We also face the challenge of a limited national regulatory authority capacity. And as Honorable Minister mentioned, we have to make a very intensive vaccinations programs to deliver the vaccines to all the eligible people, including people living in the hard to reach area. And to do that, we need a very good plan, logistics, including the cold chain, human resources, and we have to generate the people's demand or the acceptance and information system, including the vaccine adverse event. And Honorable Minister mentioned about the COVAX. I think this is something out of very challenging situations, positive things. The COVAX is the mechanism that developed by the global collaborations to expedite the development of the vaccines and distribution. They also faced some challenges at the very beginning, but now they have distributed more than 1.3 billion doses to 144 countries and areas around the world. And this was possible because of the collaborations with the public and private sectors, but also so many countries' contributions. And I obviously think this is the area that we should continue to strengthen. Over to you.
Do you think that, you know, now that there is more vaccine available, right? Production has increased and many places have vaccinated quite a lot and there's no longer like people lining up to get vaccinated. Do you think that we have put to bed the issue of supply? Is there enough vaccine in the world now in order to get it to everybody who needs it? Or are we still in that effort of trying to distribute it equitably across the world?
If you think about what I have mentioned, that ensuring the access to fair access to the vaccines for all countries during the pandemic, I think it is important to continue to put the effort in increased production capacity. And I'm very happy to see there are movement in the countries to try to establish their own production capacity so that they have multiple options in getting the vaccines. Several countries in Asia, including Indonesia, and several countries in my regions have now selected as the countries to receive the mRNA vaccine technology transfer. And I very appreciate that the Republic of Korea are committed to serve as a biomanufacturing training hub. And I think these are kind of positive things to continue to make investment in increasing the production capacity in this area.
Minister Budi, do you feel like you do have enough access to vaccinations at this point? And to what extent is Indonesia looking to, build infrastructure in order to manufacture more vaccinations for the future for both coronavirus and for whatever pandemic occurs next?
So related with your first questions, now Indonesia have much more vaccine than needed. So even for the vaccine that we procure, because we have enough free vaccine from COVAX that we use as a primary vaccine, even now we can use and now we increase already the vaccination program, not only for adults, but even down to children. So below 6 years old. And we do have enough vaccine. As I mentioned to you, we have done 355 million doses, so 192 million people. And our population target is 208 million. So it's close to the target populations that we will achieve. So again, the vaccine is enough for Indonesia. I don't know exactly the condition for other country, but what I heard is more about the executions, or the logistic, also getting the people to go and do the vaccination rather than the supply of the vaccine itself. And I also heard that in many developed countries, millions of vaccine is actually expired. Many million of vaccine is already expired. It shows that we have more vaccine than we need. It's a matter of executing, vaccinating the people. On your second questions, I just arrived from CEPI meeting because Indonesia now has become a member of CEPI. It is a coalition of vaccine research and development and also manufacturer. And Indonesia is committed to participate in CEPI 100 days program. So CEPI program is for the next pandemic, we should be able to create and produce vaccine within 100 days. Not like 10 years as before, or like 22 or 24 weeks, like what we have done, 22 months, 22 months what we have done now. The ambitions of the global players in vaccine is we would like to research and develop and produce in 100 days, the vaccine for the next pandemic. Therefore, Indonesia is very committed to establish the mRNA vaccine research and development group. We have a business-to-business directly with the patent holder of mRNA vaccine. We go through WHO. We have been assigned as one of the participating country for mRNA hubs, the global hubs, manufacturing hubs. And we are also doing it bilaterally with another research institutions. Like in Brazil, they have Fiocruz, in Rwanda, in other countries that have initiative for mRNA technology, because this is the technology of vaccine development that will allow us to produce a vaccine less than 100 days.
Minister Budi, you point out that, certainly in many parts of the world, we do have vaccines expiring because they haven't been used. And we did even see that early in the pandemic where it wasn't efficiently rolled out to many countries. I know that you guys, as many countries did, had a big Delta outbreak last year. I'm wondering to what extent you feel like lack of fast sharing of vaccine might have contributed to that. And do you think that actually worsened the situation in some places like Indonesia and elsewhere? And is that why this moving towards creating your own vaccination is important?
Yeah. That is a lesson that we learned. Actually, we have contracted and scheduled before Delta outbreak. Delta outbreak in Indonesia happens in June and July. So we have quite a significant amount of contracted vaccine on delivery on May. But unfortunately, before it happens in Indonesia, the Delta outbreak happens in India, if I'm not mistaken, in April or May. And India, to be honest, is the largest vaccine manufacturing. So I can understand the logic of my Indian colleague. If they have a huge outbreak in India, so all the production from India manufacturing side, will be directed to the Indian continent, and that's what happened actually. So most of the supply of the vaccine was delayed because then the vaccine that is produced and come from India cannot get out from the country, and that I think that will become a global problem. So that is the reason. But I'm a person that would like to spend energy and time looking forward rather than looking backward. So it really convinced us as an Indonesian that we need to establish a much better healthcare resiliency in the country. So that is also the reason we have the PQ, the vaccine manufacturer certified by WHO to produce polio vaccine, which is bought by WHO to be distributed globally. The issue is we cannot find the mRNA technology yet. So now what we are doing, we just expand our manufacturer from 1 into 3, and we are aggressively looking for all vaccine platform. We only have before, we can only do virus-based or unit protein-based. Now we would like to do factor-based like AstraZeneca, and also nucleic acid-based like Moderna and Pfizer. So actually the problem gives us warning that we need to improve our health system resiliency very, very fast. So it's good actually. Now we are building that capacity very, very quickly.
Yeah, excellent. Dr. Kasai, I'm wondering if you can address a little bit of that issue in terms of across Asia and really across the world. To what extent was lack of early access to the vaccine, did that exacerbate the situation with Delta and with the earlier phase of the outbreak? And I'm wondering if you think that we might be seeing that lingering on the back end here, whether there might be some countries that are exiting the pandemic while others are still trying to get things under control and grappling with infections on the ground.
In our region, particularly before we have sufficient vaccines, we advocated repeatedly, vaccine is important, but vaccine alone cannot control the pandemic. And therefore, it is very important to combine with the other measures, such as public health social measures, to minimize the death and social disruptions. It's very difficult to answer that questions, and it's very difficult to quantify, but I wanted to answer the impact of those delay in 3 ways. One is that the vaccine can prevent severe diseases and death. Late last year, I visited a small rural hospital in the country of my regions. And I was very sad to learn that 4 nurses in that hospital who are not vaccinated lost their life because of the COVID-19. If they could have these vaccines, 3, if not 4 of them could have been saved. The second point is that vaccines can make our control less stringent, because vaccine is proven to be effective in preventing the severe diseases. And therefore, it can also reduce the burden of healthcare. So that means if the surge is maintained within that existing healthcare capacity, we can keep our control less stringent. And lastly, the vaccine can make a chance of virus to be muted less. So if we have more vaccines, we have reduced the chance of encountering new variants, including the variants of concern that we've been encountering in the past 2 waves.
And on that note, we're going to have to wrap it up. Minister Budi, Dr. Kasai, thank you so much for joining us. And thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation half as much as I did. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And thank you very much, Honorable Ministers.
Thank you very much, Michelle and Dr. Kasai.
You are the last best hope of Earth. We ask you to protect it. are we and all living things we cherish our history. Thank you very much.
So what has the Paris Climate Agreement achieved since 2015? Five years ago, the world reached a historic deal. 195 countries signed the Paris Climate Agreement. For the first time, we had a global treaty that truly tackled the urgency of climate change. And yet, it was deemed weak. It was all voluntary. If a country set a goal and didn't meet it, what was the punishment? Nothing but scorn from other countries. If a country left the accord, like the US did, no one could stop it from leaving.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord.
But that's the beauty, one expert told me. The agreement's weakness is also its strength. By being inclusive, it appealed to so many different sectors of the economy that it helped spur the direction of travel. And the results are for all to see. Hundreds of companies are going to zero out emissions by mid-century. It includes not only tech companies such as Microsoft and Google, but also oil giants like Shell and BP. It's not just consumer goods companies, but mining conglomerates. And it's happening in a year when the economy has been rattled by the pandemic. That's surprising, right? Well, not to a group of people working for the United Nations. 2 years ago, they predicted that if companies don't set net zero goals soon, they will be forced to do so by 2025. They called this the inevitable policy response, a wonky but powerful phrase. The main argument was that as the realities of climate change became increasingly apparent, governments will be forced to act. And that's exactly what's happened. In the last 18 months, 7 of the 10 largest economies in the world have set goals to reach net zero emissions. That's having all sorts of knock-on effects. Businesses and investors are singing a different tune on climate change these days. So far so good, but if the emissions don't start to decline for real, there may come a point when governments enforce even stricter policies, and suddenly. That could cause some businesses to become worthless overnight, which would leave investors with stranded assets and make us all poor. That's because these investors don't just manage money for billionaires. Many of them are managing pensions of people like you and me. And so acting on climate change isn't just the morally right thing to do. It's also the financially prudent choice. In a way, the inevitable policy response is already playing out. It's a good bet that we'll see more countries join in. That ultimately is the greatest achievement of the Paris Climate Agreement, reached without the threat of any real punishment, but by convincing the world that the threat of climate change is real. This is Net Zero. I'm Akshat Rathi. Follow us on Quick Take and Bloomberg.
Hello and welcome. My name is Juliet Saleh. I am a reporter and presenter with Bloomberg Radio and Television based here in Singapore. Delighted to welcome you today to our panel called Catalyzing Asia's Low Carbon Economy. And with me today to discuss is Wei Xin Chan, Global Head of Climate Change Centre and ESG Research at HSBC based in Hong Kong. And we also have Leti Tutui, Global CEO of VinFast. We did see the COP26 summit conclude in Glasgow with a watered-down pledge, this after lobbying from India and China, and that could put Southeast Asia in severe existential danger as one of the world's most vulnerable regions to climate change. Now, of course, we are also seeing this devastating humanitarian crisis unfold in Ukraine. We have seen a surge in commodities driven by that war, crude pushing higher, and we saw the US saying that it will ban the import of Russian crude. I want to discuss all the implications of this, what we're seeing in the metals market, potential further reliance on fossil fuels, and of course what Southeast Asia can do to try and move further towards climate adaptation. Tui, let's start with you, because we did see these extraordinary moves in nickel Tuesday. We know the LME has now suspended those trades, reversed them, but we saw that 250% gain. that is going to add a lot of concerns about the cost of producing EV vehicles. Morgan Stanley saying something it could be like $1,000 extra to produce an EV vehicle. Your thoughts in this extraordinary moves we've been seeing in commodities and how it is possible for a company like yours to meet EV demand in this environment?
Thank you. We are also watching the current market, and obviously there are a lot of challenges right now. But we are sticking to our plan and to start delivering EVs to the international market this year, specifically in the US, EU, and Canada. And we already started delivering EVs in Vietnam. So we just are marching forward with the plan for this year.
You're not concerned about levels of these commodities making it viable and I guess making a consumer decide that perhaps it's too expensive for them to move into EVs?
I think like we are facing the supply chain challenges like everybody else, but I think for this year we should be okay. I think we've been looking at this for the last few weeks, right? It could be an interesting time for EVs because with the gasoline price going up, like the gasoline price being like over $6 per gallon in California, and it's pretty high elsewhere. It's a good opportunity for us because the way that because it becomes cheaper to own an EV. So I think it's a good point for EVs to penetrate the market, and I think it's an opportunity for us.
All right, a silver lining in the cloud as we see people potentially switch to renewables. Wei Shin, I wanted to get your thoughts too, particularly on this surge in commodities, the concern about a further reliance on fossil fuels, and what you think can be done to try to adapt here, and I guess some of the options we have and some of the cost challenges too.
Well, certainly things have changed from the way people envisage 2022 to be. That is for sure. One of the main aims for 2022 from a climate change perspective was to sort of revisit and strengthen their climate pledges for countries and companies to do that. And that was happening all the way. And now we're seeing some changes because people having to rethink their fuel sources, rethink their energy, and rethink the way they do those plans. So the EU has just come out with a sort of renewed plan for renewables and diversifying their energy sources. So I think there'll be a lot more rethinking in boardrooms around the world.
How vulnerable do you think Southeast Asian countries are to climate change risks, and I guess how you could see countries and I guess companies too try to adapt here?
The IPCC put out their report on the last day in February, and so that highlights the urgency of climate change, and definitely tells us about the impacts that are available for the Southeast Asian region. Now, if we look at some of the risks that are apparent that came out of the IPCC report, that's very, very interesting because it shows that there are a whole bunch of different types of risks, but those specifically lying to low-lying coastal systems, so natural coastal protection, habitats, disruption of transportation, loss of lives and livelihood, terrestrial marine ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, and then city and crucial infrastructure and how that works across networks. That all applies to Southeast Asia if we think about the coastal communities that we have, the way that the transportation systems work in terms of coastal areas. That is something that Southeast Asian nations really need to be prepared for. And they're doing that by making changes to not just their climate plans, but also the way they are trying to adapt their financial systems and various economic systems. We saw in the budget in Singapore in February that they're making changes to their carbon taxes in the coming years as well, and then announced quite recently as well they're hoping to revisit and strengthen their own climate pledges by the end of this year, looking forward to mid-century. So they are making changes to the risks that are not going to go away, and regardless of what happens around the world, these risks will probably increase when it comes from a climate change point of view.
So just a follow-up on that, are they making changes quickly enough?
That's a good question, Julia. I don't think any country is making changes quickly enough. Certainly, emissions continue to rise, and as a result of global events this year, I think they will continue to rise, and that is not good enough. The green recovery that we were expecting from the sort of pandemic era, so to speak, where the investments that were made were going to be done with sustainability in mind, that hasn't quite come through. And so, what we are seeing now globally is a continuation of these extreme events, the wildfires, the floods, the storms and the droughts, and that will continue to have an effect on food security, and it will also continue to sort of focus the mind on the energy security situation. And so they're not making changes that are quickly enough in order to limit the temperature rises that we're seeing and the emissions that are causing that.
Twee, if I get back to you, I mean, we have spoken about the EV production, so you are already making inroads there, but tell us what VinFast is doing in terms of hitting climate change and cutting goals, carbon-related goals here, in fact, reliance on carbon.
We are very strongly committed to a sustainable future. So VinFast has established a comprehensive ecosystem of EVs and related services in Vietnam, including e-scooters, electric cars, electric buses, and advanced charging stations in the whole nation. As of February 2022, this year, we have deployed 2,000 charging stations and offering about 40,000 charging ports in 63 cities and provinces in Vietnam, with the capacity to be expanded in the upcoming years. Also, in furthering Vietnam's commitment to sustainable future, we have also announced the plan to cease all the production of internal combustion engine vehicles by the end of the year. This move has made VinFast one of the world's first OEM that switched to fully EV production to develop a sustainable transportation solution for the future. And last but not least, we also have been progressively researching for on application of eco-friendly materials in our production, some of the eco-friendly leather, for example. We're taking drastic measures in reducing wastewater, harmful chemicals, and designing comprehensive strategy for battery production, management, and as well as recycling. And with all those measures, we hope to minimize the negative impacts on the environment and shaping a more sustainable future.
There are risks for not being prepared properly for ESG practices. And I guess when you've just outlined some of the reasons or some of the movements that VinFast is making, what would be some of your top tips for other businesses in Southeast Asia to be prepared here? Because there's also a financial risk if you're not.
Yeah, I think in the last, I would say in the last 2 years or so, ESG is becoming a big focus for all the industry, from businesses like private sector like us to government, and also a lot of investors also very, very focused on ESG. So I think it's going to happen very soon that if you don't have a very clear ESG in place, then you become not as friendly to the investor. So we have been preparing for this for the past 2 years or so. We have ESG policy in place. We even have green financing framework in place with the help of HSBC here, and we also issued the first green bond in Asia as well, also with the help with HSBC. And we have been putting in place the ESG policy as well as we have the annual audit of our policy and our compliance as well. So we trying to do our part, but also preparing for the future, because we think that they're not being ESG friendly is going to be it's going to take toll on the business.
All right, there's 2 points you touched on there that I want to ask Wei Shin's thoughts are, and they are, of course, the trends we're seeing in green bonds, issuing finance, but also, of course, the transparency here. We heard from Twee there about in terms of course, being audited, but what is the transparency for some companies if they're not meeting these goals?
Yeah, that's very, very important, Juliet. If they're not meeting these goals and not being transparent, investors will see that. We're seeing a growing number of regulators around the region and indeed around the world who are asking for sort of stricter standards for not just the disclosures that companies make, but also the disclosures that funds themselves make. And that is interesting because everyone is trying to weed out greenwashing. So this is where companies or investors are pretending to be green when they're not really. And that is not conducive to helping countries and the world meet their climate and sustainability goals. Green bonds are an important way to signal that companies are contributing to that. So where they're ring fencing the use of proceeds for green purposes and green projects. Now, those green projects have to be transparent in the way that they collect information and the way that they execute and implement their sustainability goals within that. So we've seen green bonds around the region grow, and that's an important way of doing financing. But I think investors are also looking to alternative forms of green financing, and that innovation is very, very important to a sort of sustainable future in ASEAN and around the world.
How are companies being held accountable if they are greenwashing?
There are different strategies of doing this. I think if you ask any fund manager, they'll say, well, we could ultimately divest, and that's one way of doing it, very popular a few years ago. But I think the engagement and voting approach is much, much more prevalent these days, where investors actually go to these companies and say, we would like to engage with you. We want you to sort of make better disclosures and tell us how you're doing this climate change strategy, for example, and how you're implementing this. Does it involve oversight from the board? Does it involve a change in business model? How will your visions be actually implemented? And if a company cannot articulate that, then there's an element of greenwashing there. So the onus is on both the investor to actually ask how they're doing it, and for the companies to actually demonstrate how they're doing it with regular reporting and auditing and monitoring and checking, as Madam Tui said. And that is I think, an ongoing and circular process that needs to be done on behalf of both the general public, but regulators are also pushing for that one as well. So the consequences ultimately would be a tightening of that financing if greenwashing were too prevalent, so to speak.
We're talking about a lot of developing markets too in Southeast Asia. So do you see a lot of Southeast Asia countries and potentially companies too within that falling behind when it comes to the likes of North America and Europe, which are a little bit further ahead with some of the implementation of ESG goals?
I don't think it's a case of falling behind. I think it's a case of starting a little later, but certainly we've seen a lot of markets and indeed companies in the ASEAN, Southeast Asian region move quite quickly. So we think the pace of development is very, very fast. A case in point there is the development of the ASEAN taxonomy. That's come really, really quickly on the heels of the EU taxonomy, and very, very impressively there. And not just ASEAN itself, but for example, individual countries, member states within ASEAN. So Indonesia came out with theirs a few weeks ago as well. We're seeing different regulations come in to sort of tighten this up. So ASEAN again saying that they'd like to sort of have greater scrutiny over the funds that label themselves as ESG. So companies will have to respond to that, because in order to be included in those funds and eventually sort of indices that will come as a part of that, they will have to demonstrate their credentials more structurally and more transparently. Otherwise, the investors, when they make their investment decisions, will say, I don't want this company in because it makes me look bad as a fund manager. I can't apply my own fund label. And so everyone's working together on this. The investors asking the questions, the companies giving the information, and the regulatory processes from above actually making this more transparent and making sense for everyone. So that is a rising tide in the region, not necessarily behind North America and Europe, but certainly moving a lot faster.
All right, you rephrased my question very well. Thank you for saving me there. Madam Chair, I wanted to get back to you as well. I mean, you've talked about some of the opportunities you are seeing. We did talk a little bit about the challenges too with EV batteries at the top, but what other challenges are you seeing, not only in VinFast, but across Vietnam as well, as we do try to adapt here?
You mean the challenges toward sustainable...
Towards meeting sustainable goals, yes.
Yeah, I think in Vietnam it's probably we probably face a lot some unique challenges as well to the market. But I think in general the challenges would be the expenses related to sustainable, taking the measures for the sustainable future. But I think we never really look at ourselves as, just a Vietnamese company. We always compare ourselves and want to be one of the international companies. So we've always look beyond our borders and to the top companies in the world and follow the step and do it faster.
And when you compare yourself to those companies, which you rightly are and should, where do you sort of see growth in the EV market in the next 5 years or so, or 5 to 10 years? You mentioned not only cars, scooters and the like. I mean, there's also the consumer that wants to be a lot more thoughtful with the way that they're spending their money as well and the impact they're having on the environment.
Yeah, I think right now, I think it's the point of no return for the internal combustion engine vehicles. So the world is definitely moving to EVs. It's just a matter of how fast everything moves. I think the rising energy prices actually helped the EV industry, even though some of the OEMs are also having their own challenges. But I think it's good for the industry as a whole. And as we are moving in that direction, I think that EV so far has been a little bit more expensive, both in terms of upfront costs as well, mostly upfront costs, and that's why it hasn't been that popular. So what our approach to EVs is very different from others. We don't choose a niche market or a niche segment. We go for the mass market, and we would like to take the market share from the internal combustion engine vehicles because that is the trend, and we do that by using exclusively the battery leasing model. And with that, we can bring down the upfront cost of the vehicle significantly. So our VF8 and VF9, the two biggest vehicles that we have, are priced at around $40,000 to $60,000, depending on the model and variant. So, which is like very comparable to the internal combustion engine vehicles. And on top of that, we charge the consumer like in the US, $110 or $160 per month for the for battery leasing, and we take care of the battery. We repair the battery for free. We replace the battery when it goes down to the 70% capacity, and we take care of the recycling of the battery as well. So basically, we feel like we're being responsible, by taking care of the battery and by providing the consumer with an option to own an EV at reasonable prices, at the cost or even lower cost than owning an internal combustion engine vehicles. And with that approach, we hope that we'll be able to convince more people to switch from internal combustion engine vehicles to EVs. And as of today, I think we announced the early reservation in early January in CES. And today we got about, I think, more than 45,000 early reservation already. So that actually the response from the customers all over the world to our calling, basically.
So in percentage terms, what sort of growth targets are you looking at over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of demand for your vehicles?
We have a 5-year plan that getting us to close to 1 million, or about, obviously depending on the market conditions, but getting around like 750,000, 1 million in the next 5-6 years per year.
All right, Wei Shin, I wanted to get some of your thoughts too on where we see Southeast Asia in the next 5 to 10 years as we potentially see a further increase to ESG, and focus as well on the S&G and ESG.
Yeah, that's a great question, Juliet. As I said, I think Southeast Asia is moving a lot faster than other places in the world. So the potential sustainable finance boom could be very, very beneficial to Southeast Asia. It could be a hub almost for new technologies to be incubated. It could be a hub potentially for carbon pricing and offsetting. And it could be a hub for sort of financing for other parts of Asia as well. And that is not only beneficial to some of the economies in Southeast Asia, but it's also beneficial beneficial to the local communities. In terms of in sort of 5 years' time, we're seeing, as we said earlier, Singapore beginning to sort of raise its carbon taxes, and I think carbon pricing will expand across other parts of the ASEAN economy in Southeast Asia. We're seeing inclinings of this from places like Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam as well. So that should be something that I think Southeast Asia really rides upon when it comes to carbon pricing. The benefits will really filter through as we're seeing more sort of investors say this is what we want to be a part of. So the fund flows should benefit the economies in Southeast Asia, as well as maybe the funds move their location there for whatever reason, or whether they move their funds there and invest in the region, and that investment will generate a lot of benefits for the economy. And I think it's going to be a very interesting story as the ASEAN member states move towards growing in a more sustainable way, and this could be, I think, at a much quicker pace than we're seeing in other parts of the world. So I'm very excited for the prospects for this region.
And it comes at a time when this region has been very much battered by COVID, by border closures, the impact of tourism as well. So could this potentially fuel an economic boom over the next sort of 5 years?
I'm not an economist, so I wouldn't predict any of that. But in terms of sustainability, I think it has a good sort of multiplier effect. It is longer term, though. It's not something that happens over the short term. Sustainable policies coming from regulators and governments take a while to filter through to the economy. But when they do, it tends to have a positive feedback, as you say. So hopefully sustainability will be a part of the boom that the ASEAN member states have in the next few years. And as far as tourism goes, I'd be very much on that bandwagon as well.
Yes, we hope that borders ease there where you are in Hong Kong sometime soon. We're starting to see that here. We're starting to see that in Vietnam too. Madam Thuy, I wanted to get your thoughts on how COVID impacted your company and how you're starting to see a light at the end of this very dark tunnel we've been in.
At Ring Group, we have certain businesses that were impacted by COVID. So we have the largest hospitality entertainment business in Vietnam. So obviously our hotels, resort were heavily impacted by COVID and all the closure in the last 2 years. We have shopping malls that were impacted by COVID as well. And in addition to that, we had to we also felt the responsibility of supporting our tenants. So that that was also another contribution to the tenants. So, but in general, other businesses were not really impacted by COVID as much. We managed to work at full capacity. At some point, we had to go to work from home, but most of the time, I mean, as of now, we pretty much operate at full speed. I think a lot of our employees are impacted by COVID these days, but I think this new variant, Omicron, is quite mild. And we have a hospital, so we take care of our employees and their families. So if there's any serious cases, we take them into the hospital. We take care of them. If it's not, if they are not serious, then we have hotline doctors to talk to them and send medicine and all to them. So we take care of our people, but at the same time, we keep our workforce at full speed as usual.
All right, leading by example. We thank you both very much for your time. Wei Shin Chan, Global Head of Climate Change Centre and ESG Research at HSBC in Hong Kong, and Lee Thi Thuy Thuy, Global CEO at VinFast in Vietnam. I'm Juliet Saleh from Bloomberg. We thank you very much for your time.
Now, the pandemic has led to the closure of schools globally. At the peak of the lockdown, almost 1.6 billion children were out of the classroom. Some research suggests that time away from school will have a lifelong impact to future earnings. Let's get insights from Singapore's Minister for Education, Chan Chun Sing. Minister, good to have you with us.
Thank you, Haslinda. Good to see you again.
And you. Now, Singapore was one of the last countries to close its schools, one of the first to reopen, much to the relief of parents, I'm sure, especially when compared to places like Hong Kong. How did you manage to do that? What was the thinking?
Well, Haslinda, we have never actually closed our school in a sense if closing schools means the stopping of our education system of learning. Actually, what we have done was that we transited into what we call blended learning with a combination of physical school with what we call home-based learning using technology. And I think that's what many other countries have done as well. So with that, we have been able to minimize the disruption to the learning of our students. But having said that, the learning of the students is not just about picking up the academic grades and the skills. That, I think, it can be done quite easily with the home-based learning over the internet. But I think we all share the longer-term concerns on the social-emotional development of our children, and also whether they have the opportunity to link up with their friends overseas.
The transition wasn't that easy, right, Minister? I mean, there were some challenges. How did you overcome them?
Well, we were a bit fortunate because in the transition, we have started this even prior to COVID. Because prior to COVID, we had this vision that, learning has to go beyond the classroom. So prior to COVID, we were beginning to make preparations for us to have what we call blended learning, which is to move some of the classes to online, because we believe this is one of the core skill sets that our students must have, the ability to learn at their own pace, using their own time, and then combine that with physical classroom. Because if we think about it, going forward, more and more of the physical classroom time will be used on collaborations and the new forms of encouraging creativity. Whereas learning is not just about the transmission of knowledge and the receiving of knowledge. If that is the only thing about learning, then today I think the internet can perform much of those functions. So we have a different vision of learning in going forward, where it's really about people coming together to collaborate and create something new. As the saying goes, we are not just trying to teach our students how to solve yesterday's problem with yesterday's solutions. We are trying to get them to solve tomorrow's problem with tomorrow's solution, and that requires collaboration.
I'll pick up on the vision slightly later, but when schools were reopened in Singapore, how did you manage to do that without the classrooms becoming, I guess, a super spreader location?
Well, there are two parts that we need to do well. One is what we call the health protocols, which means that we need strict health protocols in the school to prevent what you call it becoming a cluster or a super spreader venue. And that requires us to have safe management measures, good personal hygiene, good social habits, the wearing of masks, the regular temperature checking, and also to go in and do the tests necessary if we suspect there's a cluster of cases. So that part is what we call the management of the health protocol, and that part is a bit more straightforward. But equally important, I think for many countries, we realize that we are not just managing a health issue, we are also managing a public confidence issue. You can open the schools, but if the parents and the children are not confident of your protocols, they do not think that you are transparent with the information, they might lack the confidence for them to return back to school physically. And that is the other part that we need to do well, which is to be entirely transparent with our protocols, with the information that we have, so that we can inspire confidence in our public, our parents and our children to go back to school safely.
2 years on, some normalcy has returned. If you were to look back on the last 2 years, on hindsight, is there anything you would have done differently?
Well, I would say we would never want to waste a crisis, and there are many things that we want to do faster and better. First example would be the blended learning model. We'd like to shift more of our classes online for our students to pick up the skill set to be able to do self-paced learning. So, because this is something that they will need to do in time to come. So going forward, we expect more and more time in school to be spent on collaboration and creativity and encouraging creativity. So when less and less time on just the transmission of knowledge. So taking the lessons from COVID, we will move more and more of our lessons online, allowing our students to do self-paced learning, encouraging them to pick up the skills to learn by themselves. I think the second lesson that we can all learn from this is that technology is a great enabler to lighten the workload of our teachers. Because with good technology, you can now scale the good pedagogies, the good lessons to the classrooms across the nation as fast as you can. So that's something that we really want to do more and do faster compared to the past. Now, beyond, sorry, go ahead.
The thing is, Singapore is in a privileged position. Students have internet access, but globally, there is a digital divide. 2 in 3 children and young people below 25 lack an internet connection at home. And that, of course, is worsening the inequalities in terms of access to education. Why do you think other countries have found themselves so unprepared for remote learning?
Well, you are right. Singapore, in some sense, is a bit privileged in that we are a small nation, so it's perhaps a bit easier for us to proliferate the devices. And we do have our fair share of students and families who may not have access to broadband, but we do our best to provide them with the devices and also the bandwidth necessary outside the school environment for them to access the information and the curriculum. Now, but having said that, that is just an enabler. What really matters are really good teachers that can help guide the students, even if we have the broadband and the devices. During the pandemic, when we have to go on to home-based learning, we recognize that not every family, every child would be able to have a conducive environment at home to do the learning. And in fact, even during those times, in the most difficult of times, we kept our schools open for students with higher needs to return back to schools to be guided by the teachers physically. So I think, notwithstanding the fact that Singapore is slightly more privileged than many other countries in our ability to proliferate the devices, I think what really makes the difference is really the quality of the teachers, the commitment of our teachers to help each and every last student to assess the curriculum during the pandemic.
When we take a look at the uneven internet access, how do you think this might play out? Because it is estimated that about, 38 million children worldwide are entirely without access to schooling. How might this play out for the world? What would it mean for the most vulnerable in Asia, in Southeast Asia?
Indeed, I mean, people have talked about a potential digital divide. But on the other hand, actually, it could be a great digital leveler as well. We have seen many countries much larger than Singapore able to scale up the proliferation of access to good quality education through the internet services. So I think this is also a tremendous opportunity if we can just focus our resources on equipping our people with the devices, getting the curriculum right. And by that, I don't mean just transposing the physical classroom into the digital classroom as if we just to digitize what we call the analog version, but really to change the pedagogy and get the students engaged. I think there's tremendous opportunity. I will just use an example. This morning, I just visited a class, and during my time, the sum knowledge of everything was called the Encyclopedia Britannica. If you have a set of Encyclopedia Britannica, you kind of made it, and if you have access to a set of Encyclopedia Britannica, you have made it. And most of us don't have Encyclopedia Britannica. Maybe there's only 1 or 2 sets in the library. But today, our students have the world at their fingertips. And the question is, how do we guide them to make use of this deluge of information, this plethora of information? For them, is a new skill set that's required, which is how to sense make in a world where you have an overload of information, how to differentiate between what is right and what's wrong, what is verifiable and what is unverified. So I think those are new skill sets that we need to help our students pick up in this new world.
So given the new skill sets which are required, there needs to be a rethinking of education. It's become such a fast changing world. Adaptability, continued retraining, resilience are key. How do we rethink formal education to meet the skills needed for the future? What will the future of learning look like?
Well, I think the most important skill set that we can equip our students to learn for life is to ignite their innate curiosity and to have the passion to keep learning. And the skill set to learn, unlearn, and relearn is the most important. Because we have come to this conclusion. In a fast-changing world like what we have today, there's no way, absolutely no way for us to front-load the education system for our students and expect that to last for life. We always have this saying that today in the past, we spent maybe 15 to 20 years front-loading the education system, and then we put all the investments up front in the first 15 to 20 years to prepare them for the first job. But then we forget to ask ourselves, how much time and how much resources do we spend on our people as they grow to become adults for the next 5 to 10 jobs? And a very few people will actually just do one job throughout their whole life now. and people change job every few years. And our challenge is how do we re-equip our people every few years, which is why in Singapore, we say that we must go from MOE, the Ministry of Education, just for schools, to the Ministry of Education for life. Our job of educating and training our people doesn't stop with the first 15 to 20 years. We need new programs, new pedagogies, new andragogies to equip our adult learners so that they can learn throughout life. And the other change I think that we need to make is this. There's this saying that the adults must go back to school. I think it's not the right concept, because it's very difficult for adults to go back to school, because adults have their own financial responsibilities, family commitments, and so many other things demanding their time and attention. But instead, for the adult andragogy, we need to bring the school to the adults, so that such that anyone can learn anything, anywhere, at their own time. So that will be a fundamental change.
Minister, in my conversation with DBS CEO Piyush Gupta, he said that the best way to instill the right way of thinking among students to meet the needs of the future is to equip them with social sciences subjects. How do you respond to that?
Well, in Singapore, we are increasingly emphasizing what we call interdisciplinarity. We want our people to have the basic STEM foundation, STEM meaning the science, technology, engineering and mathematics foundation, but you also need to develop the other part of it, the aesthetic, the social sciences and so forth, so that in future, when we are solving tomorrow's problem with tomorrow's solution, the tomorrow's solution can come from elements from both the science and the arts background. And you need this ability to blend different perspectives together to create those new solutions to solve some of the very challenging problems that we have in the world today. So you cannot just depend on the knowledge from one particular field. But where people specialize, whether it's in the science or in the arts, they can make their choices depending on their interests and their preferences. But having said that, we want to equip everyone with a bit of exposure to both. So if you like, it's a bit of a T-shaped model. People specialize in different things, but everyone must have a bit of a breadth in the span of things that they learn.
If skills become obsolete so fast, is there a need to emphasize, for instance, tertiary education? I can take courses that would be relevant to what I want to pursue. In a meritocratic system like Singapore, how would you view such an approach?
Well, I would say a couple of things. First, whether you get a degree or a diploma is just a means to an end. And it's definitely not the end of learning. In fact, we have this term, we say that it's more important to have what we call continuous meritocracy. A single exam, a single degree, and single diploma will not define the outcome for your entire life. In fact, just as the jobs change every few years, it also opens up opportunities for our people every few years. Then the survival of the fittest depends on who can evolve the fastest. It doesn't depend so much as just your starting point or your resources, but it depends on the speed of evolution. Then the question is, how do we help our people to evolve faster by equipping and re-equipping them with the skills in a just-in-time manner? And that is a challenge going forward for all education systems across the world.
Then is it fair to expect that Singapore would have to rethink, I guess, academic success, how academic success is defined?
Yes, I've been speaking about this quite often recently. How do we define success for our children? And I have a couple of thoughts to share with my teachers whenever I meet them. First, success doesn't mean that you achieve some macro score at the population level. Success means bringing out the best in every individual, right? And the success means that they can keep surpassing themselves rather than surpassing some other people in an exam. It's more important for us to surpass and keep surpassing ourselves throughout life than to surpass someone else in a particular exam or test. So that's the first point. The second thing about success is that if we can ignite the innate curiosity for our people to learn, to be self-motivated learner, then I think we have set them on the correct path in life. So there's no point trying to force feed them or to front load the education system for them if they do not appreciate the joy of learning. The third thing is that success comes from ability to appreciate diversity of perspective. It means that we allow our people to connect with people from different cultures, different backgrounds, so that they can work as a team, to collaborate as a team beyond just the absorption of knowledge or the transmission of knowledge by the institutions. But all this require us to change the way we approach teaching and approach learning.
A lot to mull over. Minister, we thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you, Haslinda.
Welcome to our panel. I am Joanna Ossinger, and I cover cryptocurrencies and global markets for Bloomberg News. With me today here at the Future of Money, we have Sheila Warren, CEO of the Crypto Council for Innovation, co-host of the Money Reimagined podcast, and a longtime presence in the crypto space in many capacities, and Kai Peng, the CEO of Indonesian crypto exchange Toko Crypto and honorary secretary at the Singapore Chamber of Commerce Indonesia. Thanks to these illustrious panelists for participating today. Let's start with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what that's taught us about crypto. What do you see at this point as takeaways for the industry? Where is it succeeding or failing to act as expected, kind of the crypto complex generally? Sheila, do you want to start with that?
I can. Thanks, Joanna. It's so great to be here today. Thanks for having me. I think that we've seen that crypto, like technology, is really a tool. And so we've seen it being used by Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government itself, to basically crowdfund a defense, which is a staggering concept and unprecedented in human history. We've also seen tremendous amounts and outpouring of humanitarian aid from all over the world in support of the Ukrainian people and displaced persons in general as a result of this invasion. We've also seen concerns, I think largely misplaced, about sanctions evasions by Russian oligarchs and other actors on the other side of the invasion. I think that we've been able to provide a lot of evidence and data as an industry to show where the positive effect has really been stronger than the negative effect. But I think what's important to take away for the industry, I would say, is that there's just so many misperceptions about how crypto actually functions and how it operates, what is possible and what is practical to do with crypto at this point in time. And it's been interesting to see different players, different actors in different parts of the world responding to this moment in very different ways.
Actually, Sheila, if you can I'm curious as to what you see going on in places like Afghanistan or Venezuela as well, and if there have been any sort of lessons there that, in addition to what we're seeing in Russia, Ukraine.
Well, I think in general, we've seen that crypto is a tool for censorship resistance. And so there might be actors, powerful actors within any geography, sometimes the government, sometimes powerful forces outside the government, that are looking to oppress or suppress exchange of value. And in doing so, looking to suppress the flow of ideas, I would say, and the ability of people to create livelihoods for themselves outside of what any particular regime deems appropriate. And I would say that I really think that we're seeing crypto as a tool for these freedom fighters to really be able to support their families, to be able to get resources that they need. In many cases, that really is aid. It's coming down to food and water in Ukraine, as I think is widely reported in the press, and I can confirm from what I know. And so I think that we are seeing almost the recognition, I think, in the global economy and the global political environment that this tool, this resource, is something that is proving to be quite important in times of crisis. And so we have to think very carefully, I think, therefore, about what kinds of guardrails we're going to put around it to protect and preserve its ability to function at such a time. I think the sad state of affairs is that we're not going to see less conflict as time goes on, climate change, other kinds of things. I mean, there's going to be more and more competition for more and more scarce resources, and the ability to basically operate at a community level or an individual family level in a store of value and exchange of value is going to be something that becomes more and more important, I think, as time goes on.
Okay, thanks. And Kai, do you want to take that to kind of Southeast Asia and what you're seeing in terms of what crypto does in the region, for the unbanked, for people generally?
Yeah, I think I would taking it back to Indonesia and Southeast Asia. I mean, at times of conflict, especially if we look back at it's still ongoing pandemic that we're still going through. I think crypto has been one of the tools and mechanisms for people to help raise funds in a very efficient manner, especially as we saw during COVID. We do see a lot of movements of people raising funds for purchase of oxygen concentrators, for raising funds globally to help purchase these important healthcare medical devices to bring them into Indonesia to help the government in solving the lack of oxygen in Indonesia. So that's one thing that we also saw, aside from conflict related, helping to resolve global issues on this. We saw India also had the same trend where people were raising funds through crypto. So it's interesting to see how this new form of funding is going to go as people are now more able to raise funds, to efficiently deploy them, and to bring this necessary tools to the regions that they most need.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and now one thing that has been in the news a lot lately, the U.S. regulation regarding crypto. So Joe Biden's executive order. So Sheila, can you talk a little bit about what you think at this point? Is this looking good for the industry? What's likely to play out in, say, the next few months, the next year?
Well, the executive order was long awaited. And so it was one of those kinds of things where, every Monday morning, the whole industry was like, is this the week the thing is going to drop? And so when it finally did, I think we were quite pleased as an industry and as supporters of crypto to really see the level of thoughtful attention paid to the industry. I think it's no longer possible anywhere in the world, I would say, but definitely in the United States, to be black or white about this. It's this executive order takes us right into the gray areas and says, look, there are tremendous opportunities and potential here, some of which are very spelled out in the order. There are also risks and challenges, and we know that as well as an industry. And so how can we work together? I thought it was so telling that the EO executive order required not just interagency cooperation, but specifically said that the government should be seeking guidance and support and collaboration with those outside the government. And the assumption being that there are industry experts and others, other experts in the ecosystem that can be helpful here, that can help the government, the US government, really cast about and find the right solution here. I liked the idea in the EO a lot. There is no obvious solution to this complicated industry and this complicated ecosystem, that we do need to be very forward thinking. We need to be accommodating the scope of innovation that is potentially possible here, and not assuming that what we see at the current moment is endgame, right? That this is what we're going to see. It's always going to be financial services. It's always going to be certain kinds of opportunities, right? There's a lot that this could grow to be. And what I took away from it really was we need to be mindful of that, supportive of the industry, but also be really clear that where there are bad actors, we want to make that, disincentivize it and make it really hard to commit crimes or anything else, do anything illicit using this technology and using crypto. So all in all, I would say worth the wait is kind of what the takeaway would be. This is not going to be easy. There are a number of reports the agencies have to come up with that will take a lot of time to pull together. And so I think over the course of the next months, probably even next 6 months, we're really going to see a lot of activity, a lot of collaboration, a lot of education, evidence-based advocacy, which is what my organization CCI is here to provide, that I hope will land us in a really positive place and assure that the trajectory of this technology is able to accommodate all people everywhere and not just be something that's limited to people who are very technically savvy or already very wealthy.
Okay, thank you. And Kai, what do you think? Does this do the U.S. developments matter that much for you, or what are you seeing in terms of regional regulation that you are really paying attention to?
Right. I guess for Indonesia and Southeast Asia, one of the key traits or characteristics is that as countries in Indonesia and Southeast Asia, we really do refer to the developments of the regulations in the Western countries, and a lot of the regulations within Indonesia are really referenced from overseas. Would like to just share maybe one interesting trait that has developed in Indonesia. Since the release of regulations under the Commodities and Derivatives Exchange, whereby crypto exchanges in Indonesia are regulated, volume transactions has grown tremendously since then. The number of users transacting in exchanges have grown tremendously from around 2 million back in 2018 all the way to around 11 million transacting users now in 2022. And we have seen that with regulations being in place, people are more confident in participating in this new technology and the ecosystem within this new technology. People have more trust and definitely more education and awareness. And as industry players in Indonesia, we do strongly feel for the requirements of necessary regulations to be in place, because we do observe a lot of, I would say, scams, still a lot of lack of awareness by common people, that it's still running about. Just past few days, we had people come to us and they were carrying pieces of real actual Bitcoin that they thought was actually, could be converted into a digital Bitcoin. So I think, definitely with regulations in place, it's very important for the regulators to work with all the necessary departments to come in and to identify where the illicit actions are actually happening, so that the overall broader customer protection play can come in and help to grow the space. Because the technology, I bet Sheila, Joanna, we all believe in the technology, but the more bad actors that are going to come in and corrupt the place, it's gonna affect the technology. It's gonna make people lose faith and lose trust. And in the long term, if the regulators do not step in to come in and regulate this ecosystem, the people's faith and trust in it will tarnish. Yeah.
Makes sense. Thank you. And actually, one thing that I'm curious for your take on, Kai, I believe a few months ago, a Muslim council in Indonesia made a ruling on crypto and said that some of it is forbidden. Is that something that you're seeing as a large concern, or how are you addressing that?
There are definitely concerns, because if this ongoing issue is not properly addressed, right? If education and awareness to the to the Muslim Council is not properly addressed, there will be large repercussions should there be a day whereby they declare that it's haram, that it's not allowed for the Muslim community, which takes up a very, very large population of not only Indonesia, but around the world. This will have long-lasting impacts, like as I mentioned just now, people would lose faith in the technology, would lose trust in the technology. So we see it as it's a challenge that we have to face, and it's also an opportunity, because from the Muslim Council, they're specifically saying it's haram if you use it as a form of payment, but there's still opportunities to explore whereby how can this technology be utilized to make sure that it's compliant with Sharia law. So we see that as an opportunity for the business players within Indonesia to come in to help educate the system, to help see how can the Muslim Council fully understand and be more aware of how this technology can actually help the Muslim Council and the community to actually grow together. So I think it has both challenges. If they're not faced, if they're not addressed properly, there'll be long-lasting implications. But also, opportunities where they are open to be they are all open for discussions for and they are willing to learn. So yeah, that's our take on this.
And I'll just add to that, Joanna, quickly, that I think one of the biggest concerns that I have around it is, of course, zakat, and the idea that so much of what we were talking about, that aid, the philanthropy flow, there's a lot of diaspora funding from the Muslim community to the region, some of the regions that you mentioned, actually, including Ukraine and also Afghanistan. And so if suddenly this were to be declared haram under Sharia law, then you would actually have a significant reduction in the ability of aid, humanitarian aid, to go via zakat or other mechanisms to regions that are really in desperate need of this kind of thing, and that have actually relied on Bitcoin and other forms of crypto as a means of support for fellow members of the Muslim community. So really commend, Kai, what you're doing. And I think that there's, again, so much misunderstanding, misperception about the technology, about the opportunity, what it means and what it doesn't, what is speculation and what's not. Is it in line with gambling, which is, of course, forbidden? Like, these kinds of things are complicated. It's not easy to understand. But the hope is that as this gets more and more awareness rises around the world, as more and more governments start to weigh in on this, including Biden's executive order, but other examples as well around the world, Modi in India, others, I think we're going to see more and more appetite for really getting educated about what it is by a variety of different actors.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. So now going on to central bank digital currencies, a big topic of late. China is really in the advanced stages of testing, and there's been a lot of acceleration from other countries that are looking at it as well. So are there any developments that you think have been really interesting on that front, or anything where people that might be developing where people need to be concerned about what's going on, Sheila?
Well, first of all, the EO we were just talking about does talk about the creation of a digital dollar, and the Fed's exploration of that, which is ongoing, has been happening for many years. Now it's a bit out of stealth. There was a big report that got published recently from the Boston branch of the Fed, along with MIT's DCI. And I think that's of course one to watch. I remain a little unsure about what exactly the use case is there, but I think that there are some, and that could be quite interesting to see what happens, especially at a wholesale level. I think that the big one is the one you mentioned. It's really looking at the ECNY and kind of saying, when China really takes that massively outside of Chinese borders, defined as you see fit, depending on who you are, then I think we're going to really see, liftoff. And so already, whether it's Belt and Road, whether it's Chinese investments into Africa and infrastructure, there is a lot of press earlier about, the debt trap. A lot of India and Zambia and others really trying to say, look, we don't want to get stuck in this debt trap, with China requiring us to basically take out these loans using digital yuan, and then we're suddenly in this system we didn't necessarily want to be part of. So there's a lot of activity going on there. I will be candid, I don't think it's getting the attention in the West that it deserves. I think that there's just so much going on right now. I mean, who could fault anyone for not having a finger in every single thing that's happening in crypto around the world? But this is one that I think is going to start getting a lot more attention, particularly as China moves beyond its borders, which it's already done, but really starts to scale that extraterritorial activity with the digital yuan. And then I think we're going to see a lot more attention being paid.
Okay, thank you. And Kai, what do you think?
So from my perspective within Indonesia, from what we have been interacting together with the regulators so far, a few things that we have observed is that first, President Jokowi has stepped up to announce that for preparation for G20 summit, which will be in Indonesia, in Bali, Indonesia, he has suggested the idea of an Indonesian metaverse, wanting to create an Indonesian metaverse for the new capital city over in Kalimantan, for Jakarta, and for Bali. Now, as a key mechanism of operating within the metaverse, CBDCs would be essentially something that will be a form of transaction within the metaverse, because transactions will have to be completed in digital currencies. So with that statement, we have been seeing a lot more. We have been seeing a lot more invitations from the authorities in Indonesia. We recently had one with Bank Indonesia, whereby they have announced previously that they were interested, or they have been looking at CBDCs. But we're seeing more and more focus group discussions to discuss on what are the characteristics of stable coins and how can it be applied to CBDCs. But same like what Sheila mentioned, I think it's still a space, or it's still CBDC is still something that's not really put into much attention, especially for Indonesia. I guess within Southeast Asia region as well, they're still looking at how the Western countries and China will be implementing it within their system. But I would say that that with Pak Jokowi, President Jokowi's mention of the Indonesian metaverse, I think there will be more emphasis looking at this. Although I wouldn't come to say that Indonesia or Southeast Asia would potentially be the first movers in this space.
Okay. And now I'm curious, Kai, so about Bitcoin, and I'm not asking for a price target or something, but it's been moving really along with, say, tech stocks, as opposed to acting like kind of a store of value and a hedge. Just for basically since the pandemic started. I'm just interested in if you think there are any implications for people who might want to get into crypto, or how people need to be thinking about Bitcoin as an investment, given that fact.
I think ultimately, people's perception of Bitcoin would change over time. I think the positive correlation between tech stocks and Bitcoin is something that is required at this point in time. As there are things that's happening around the world that would be, I think that correlation between tech stocks and Bitcoin would allow for people to believe that Bitcoin as a technology will continue to grow, same like how tech stocks are growing right now. So I think this would make it more relatable for people, especially in Indonesia, as they would then see that correlation between how Tesla would be, or how a Tesla or Apple stock would be valued, and they would then be able to see that, okay, with Bitcoin, there are ways of valuing it based on how many people are using it, based on the number of transactions are happening on it, and with that mindset, that would then allow for people not to just go in blindly, but to actually be more aware of the technology that's powering behind it, more aware of the use cases that can be used on Bitcoin. So ultimately, I think that correlation would allow for more people to be streamed into being aware of Bitcoin and crypto and to come into that space, because people are be able to relate to it.
Yeah. So basically, what do you think is something that is big in crypto that isn't really being paid attention to enough, or you think is going to be hugely important that people just need to be thinking about?
Okay, I think like I mentioned just now, within Indonesia, there's a huge, globally as well, there's huge emphasis on NFTs and metaverses, and everyone's just sucked into the idea of wanting to follow this trend. But I think, if I think about technology, right, metaverse is kind of like the front end, while the back end connections, like the wallets, like the technology improvements on the protocol layers, I think people are not really focusing on that, which I think is key and crucial for making sure that the technology works. Yes, the front end, the metaverses, they all look very good. They look very nice, and it's a nice place to escape to. But ultimately, how to power all this, the key, the integration, how can this technology be integrated into our everyday lives? I think that's what some people are losing focus on. How can they be integrated seamlessly into our phones, whereby they will be integrated into our payment channels? How can they be integrated into the payment for electricity or payment for gas? That's something that people are not focusing on, because I guess that's more of the backend infrastructure that has to be really, there's a lot of existing infrastructure that has to be adapted in order to be in order for blockchain technology to be implemented on them. So I think that's something that is people are losing focus on, and that's something that we should be focusing on.
Okay, thank you. And to wrap it up, Sheila, is this crypto's moment? We've got everything going on in Russia and Ukraine. We've got the Biden executive order. There is so much focus on it, but is this kind of the time for the industry, or are we still not quite there yet?
I don't think that crypto is going to have one moment. I think that crypto is the future. And so I think that what we're going to see over time are many moments where there are societal revelations of the power of this technology and of what it can accomplish. If it's again, if the guardrails are correct, if the enabling environment, both politically, economically, and socially, exists to help really ensure this technology progresses along a path that's pro-social. So I don't know that I ever described anything as crypto's moment. I do think this is one of, I think, a number of moments that have happened over the course of the past 10 years and will continue to happen, where there is suddenly an escalation of awareness of the importance of crypto. But my view is that crypto is not only here to stay, it's really going to be massively transformative in every sector of society going forward. So yes and no, I guess is my answer, Joanna. And I'm really hopeful that this marks, again, heightened awareness on the part of political leaders of the importance of crypto, of taking it very seriously, of understanding you can't have a black or white position on this. You have to get into the gray. You have to really understand it before you try to wrestle with it and regulate it, because it's complicated. It's a complicated ecosystem that we're all engaged with. And so I'm heartened by what I see, and I'm optimistic for positive progress.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I think we will leave it there. So thank you to Sheila and Kai for serving as panelists today. And thank you to the audience for listening in.
ท่านผู้นำและรัฐมนตรีจากประเทศสมาชิกอาเซียนผู้นำภาคธุรกิจและแขกผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านผมรู้สึกยินดีที่ได้รับเชิญให้มาร่วมแสดงวิสัยทัศน์ในการประชุมผู้นำธุรกิจอาเซียนของสำนักข่าว Bloomberg ครั้งที่ 7 ร่วมกับผู้นำรัฐบาลและผู้บริหารภาคธุรกิจระดับโลกในหัวข้อการนำความเติบโตกลับมาสู่ระดับก่อนโควิดซึ่งนับเป็นเป้าหมายหลักของทุกประเทศรวมถึงประเทศไทยการแพร่ระบาดของโควิด -19 ในช่วง 2 ปีที่ผ่านมาทำให้แต่ละประเทศต้องหันกลับมาทบทวนตนเองเร่งแสวงหาจุดแข็งและก้าวไปข้างหน้าบนเส้นทางของการฟื้นตัวอย่างมั่นคงสำหรับประเทศไทยในปี2564เศรษฐกิจของไทยค่อยๆฟื้นตัวอย่างต่อเนื่องโดย GDP เติบโตร้อยละ 1.6 และในปี 2565 คาดว่าเศรษฐกิจของไทยจะเติบโตประมาณร้อยละ 3.5 ถึง 4.5 โดยจะได้แรงหนุนจากหลายปัจจัยอาทิการปรับตัวดีขึ้นของอุปสงค์ภายในประเทศการขยายตัวอย่างต่อเนื่องของภาคการส่งออกและการฟื้นตัวของภาคการท่องเที่ยวโดยช่วงหัวเลี้ยวหัวต่อที่สำคัญในการก้าวเข้าสู่ยุคหลังโควิด -19 ประเทศไทยให้ความสำคัญกับแนวทาง 3 ประการเพื่อนำความเติบโตกลับมาและสร้างเศรษฐกิจให้มีความยั่งยืนเข้มแข็งและครอบคลุมได้แก่ 1. ยั่งยืนด้วยการเสริมสร้างการเติบโตทางเศรษฐกิจที่มีความสมดุลโดยมีโมเดลเศรษฐกิจ BCG เป็นวาระแห่งชาติเพื่อฟื้นฟูและขับเคลื่อนการเติบโตสีเขียวตลอดจนสร้างมูลค่าเพิ่มแก่สินค้าและบริการโดยใช้องค์ความรู้ด้านเทคโนโลยีและนวัตกรรมรวมทั้งให้ความสำคัญกับการดำเนินธุรกิจที่เป็นมิตรกับสิ่งแวดล้อมและมีความรับผิดชอบต่อสังคม 2. เข้มแข็งด้วยการใช้ประโยชน์จากวิทยาศาสตร์เทคโนโลยีและนวัตกรรมในการพัฒนาภาคเศรษฐกิจที่เป็นจุดแข็งของประเทศอาทิการเกษตรอัจฉริยะอุตสาหกรรมอาหารอุตสาหกรรมสีเขียวพลังงานหมุนเวียนและการท่องเที่ยวที่ยั่งยืนรวมทั้งการพัฒนาขีดความสามารถและการปรับตัวของผู้ประกอบการไมโคร SME ในยุคหลังโควิดตลอดจนการเสริมสร้างห่วงโซ่อุปทานในภูมิภาคที่ยั่งยืนยืดหยุ่นหลากหลายและมั่นคง 3. ครอบคลุมด้วยการสร้างระบบนิเวศทางเศรษฐกิจที่เอื้อต่อการทำธุรกิจโดยเฉพาะเศรษฐกิจดิจิทัลเพื่อยกระดับศักยภาพของเศรษฐกิจไทยและรับมือกับความท้าทายในอนาคตโดยเน้นการพัฒนาความเชื่อมโยงของโครงสร้างพื้นฐานที่ประชาชนและธุรกิจรายย่อยเข้าถึงได้การพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจแพลตฟอร์ม e-commerce และดิจิทัลสตาร์ทอัพตลอดจนพัฒนาทักษะดิจิทัลแก่ภาคแรงงานและธุรกิจในระดับภูมิภาคการดำเนินการตามข้อริเริ่มต่างๆโดยเฉพาะกรอบการฟื้นฟูที่ครอบคลุมของอาเซียนและแผนการดำเนินการตามกรอบเริ่มส่งผลให้อาเซียนมีการฟื้นตัวอย่างต่อเนื่องในช่วง1 ปีที่ผ่านมาถึงแม้อาเซียนจะได้รับผลกระทบจากการแพร่ระบาดแต่อาเซียนยังคงมีศักยภาพ ในการเป็นศูนย์กลางการค้าและการลงทุนโดยการค้าสินค้าของอาเซียนขยายตัวร้อยละ 1.6 ในปี 2564 และสัดส่วนการลงทุนโดยตรงจากทั่วโลกในอาเซียนเพิ่มขึ้นจากร้อยละ 11.9 ในปี 2562 เป็นร้อยละ 13.7 ในปี 2563 และคาดว่าในปีนี้เศรษฐกิจของอาเซียนจะเติบโตร้อยละ 5.2 ทั้งนี้หากการเติบโตทางเศรษฐกิจของอาเซียนสามารถกลับมาสู่ระดับก่อนโควิดได้คาดว่า GDP ของอาเซียนจะเลื่อนจากอันดับ 5 ในปัจจุบันขึ้นมาเป็นอันดับ 4 ภายในปี 2573 ผมเชื่อมั่นว่าการบูรณาการทางเศรษฐกิจระดับภูมิภาคจะช่วยเพิ่มพลวัตทางเศรษฐกิจให้กับอาเซียนและสนับสนุนการเติบโตที่ครอบคลุมและกว้างขวางในการนี้ผมมีความยินดีที่อาเซปซึ่งเป็นเขตการค้าเสรีระดับภูมิภาคที่ใหญ่ที่สุดในขณะนี้มีผลบังคับใช้ตั้งแต่วันที่ 1 มกราคมที่ผ่านมาโดยอาเซปเป็นตลาดส่งออกที่สำคัญของอาเซียนคิดเป็นสัดส่วนเกือบร้อยละ 60 ของการส่งออกทั้งหมดของอาเซียนขณะที่การลงทุนร้อยละ 40 ในอาเซียนมาจากประเทศสมาชิกอาเซปทั้งนี้การอำนวยความสะดวกด้านการค้าการลงทุนและการบริการรวมทั้งการพัฒนาอีคอมเมิร์ซระหว่างประเทศของอาเซปจะช่วยส่งเสริมการเชื่อมโยงห่วงโซ่อุปทานและการผลิตการจ้างงานและการลงทุนที่ยั่งยืนในภูมิภาคผมจึงหวังว่าผู้ประกอบการทั้งไทยและอาเซียนโดยเฉพาะไมโคร SME จะสามารถวางกลยุทธ์ทางธุรกิจและพัฒนาสินค้าและบริการให้สามารถตอบสนองความต้องการของตลาดอาเซปรวมทั้งใช้ประโยชน์จากความตกลงอาเซปได้อย่างเต็มที่ทุกท่านครับนอกจากนี้ในขณะที่ทั่วโลกกำลังฟื้นตัวจากโควิด -19 นับเป็นโอกาสดีที่ประเทศไทยได้เป็นเจ้าภาพประชุมเอเปก 2022 ภายใต้หัวข้อหลักเปิดกว้างสร้างสัมพันธ์เชื่อมโยงกันสู่สมดุลซึ่งประเด็นสำคัญที่ไทยกำลังผลักดันได้แก่การรวมตัวทางเศรษฐกิจโดยคำนึงถึงความท้าทายใหม่ๆจากบริบทโลกที่เปลี่ยนแปลงการเร่งฟื้นคืนความเชื่อมโยงในภูมิภาคที่ปลอดภัยและไร้รอยต่อซึ่งเป็นหัวใจสำคัญในการฟื้นฟูเศรษฐกิจและการทำให้เศรษฐกิจหลังโควิด -19 เติบโตอย่างครอบคลุมยั่งยืนและสมดุลหากมองไปข้างหน้าในระยะยาวผมเห็นว่าในการขับเคลื่อนวาระการเติบโตที่ยั่งยืนและเข้มแข็งของอาเซียนเราต้องเร่งรัดการเปลี่ยนผ่านสู่ดิจิทัลโดยเฉพาะในกระบวนการทางการค้าการบริหารจัดการห่วงโซ่อุปทานดิจิทัลการพัฒนาโครงสร้างพื้นฐานและความเชื่อมโยงด้านดิจิทัลและการพัฒนานวัตกรรมดิจิทัลควบคู่ไปกับการให้ความสำคัญต่อการบรรลุเป้าหมายด้วยการเปลี่ยนแปลงสภาพภูมิอากาศและการก้าวไปสู่เศรษฐกิจและสังคมคาร์บอนต่ำผ่านการส่งเสริมการลงทุนและธุรกิจที่เป็นมิตรต่อสิ่งแวดล้อมการขับเคลื่อนการลงทุนในเทคโนโลยีสีเขียวและการเปลี่ยนผ่านสู่พลังงานสะอาดเป็นต้นทั้งนี้การเป็นหุ้นส่วนระหว่างภาครัฐกับเอกชนและการสนับสนุนของประเทศคู่เจรจาและภาคีภายนอกของอาเซียนรวมทั้งการใช้ประโยชน์จากข้อริเริ่มของอาเซียนด้านการเงินที่ยั่งยืนอาทิกลไกการเงินสีเขียวของอาเซียนล้วนมีความสำคัญอย่างยิ่งต่อการขับเคลื่อนวาระสีเขียวของอาเซียนสุดท้ายนี้ผมเชื่อว่าภาคธุรกิจอาเซียนมีความพร้อมมีศักยภาพและความสามารถในการปรับตัวและแสวงหาโอกาสใหม่ๆในยุคหลังโควิด -19 โดยมีความร่วมมือระหว่างภาครัฐกับเอกชนเป็นปัจจัยสำคัญในการพัฒนาระบบนิเวศที่เกื้อกูลต่อการขับเคลื่อนการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจที่ยั่งยืนเข้มแข็งและเป็นมิตรต่อสิ่งแวดล้อมเพื่อนำความเจริญเติบโตกลับมาสู่ภูมิภาคและเพื่อให้อาเซียนเป็นประชาคมที่ก้าวหน้าและไม่ทิ้งใครไว้ข้างหลังโอกาสนี้ผมขอเน้นย้ำถึงความมุ่งมั่นของไทยในการขับเคลื่อนประชาคมอาเซียนและส่งเสริมการรวมตัวของภูมิภาคให้แน่นแฟ้นยิ่งขึ้นเพื่อให้อาเซียนเป็นพลังสำคัญในการขับเคลื่อนเศรษฐกิจของภูมิภาคและของโลกเพื่อประโยชน์ของประชาชนของเราสืบต่อไปขอบคุณครับ
And And that concludes the Bloomberg ASEAN Business Summit. Thanks again to all our speakers for a wonderful program. And thank you to our presenting sponsor, HSBC. And most of all, thank you for being such an engaged audience. We hope you enjoyed these conversations. To rewatch any part of this event, you can come back to this website where the recordings will be uploaded. You can also access videos of all interviews on the Bloomberg Live YouTube page. Thanks for joining us.